Welcome to everyone. Before we call the roll, I want to let folks know that the task force intends to suspend the rules to stand informally and allow for public discussion and engagement on agenda items 5 and 6, and also may suspend the rules on other matters so that we can have more interaction with our fellow residents who are attending. And I'm very sorry that we weren't quick in suspending the rules the other night to do that. I'm sorry. I think you were at the meeting. And I was on the phone from Arizona, but I think I saw you. And we felt really badly about that. It's our intention to operate that way generally. So while these meetings are being run by Robert's rules, we also will be pausing to allow members of the task force to to make a motion to suspend the rules to allow discussion and questions from those in attendance. So members of the task force will be counting on you when it's obviously the thing to do to make a motion to suspend the rules. And I'm going to revisit this point of information in a little while if more people join the meeting so that people understand that there will be opportunities to engage. So with that said, let me take the roll. Sherry Carter. Justice Castaneda.
Here.
Sarah Eskrich.
Here.
Rebecca Kemble.
Here.
Maggie Northrup.
Here.
Kathy Patton. John Rothschild.
Here.
Jerry Vang. Eric Upchurch. Paul Skidmore. We have quorum, so we may proceed. The next item on the agenda concerns the minutes from our meeting on Monday evening, March 19th. You have those minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes of the March 19th.
Second.
There's been a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
I'd like to add the letter T to the word notice under language to put on agenda.
We're not going to have noise, we'll have notice. All right, can we make that correction?
Yes.
We don't need a motion to do that, I don't think. Any other discussion? All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are approved. Has anyone signed up for public comment? Is that how we do it? Or do people, okay, do we have anyone who has signed up?
No one signed up for public comment. Assuming you suspend the rules later, there'll be plenty
Right.
of possibility for them to comment.
Good. Are there any, does anyone on the task force need to make any required disclosures or recuse him or herself under city rules? All right. Now we come to, I think, a real treat. Staff from the city, Karl, I think you're our leader, are going to make a presentation for us on options for public participation. And I want to just say before we begin that this presentation is a beginning as we think about options for public engagement. This is the beginning of our education ourselves, of thinking about options. We certainly will be inviting members of the task force, members of the public, and others to make suggestions about public engagement and to join in the conversation and the consideration about this really important topic. So, thank you. Yes, John.
I guess at this time, I'd like to move suspension of the rules to allow public participation, assuming that in the presentation, it is the option of the presenter to call on any of us, whether that be a member of the task force or a member of the public who wants to ask a question.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Good. So we're operating under a suspension of the rules, and if someone behind you is waving their hand, I'll let you know, okay?
So I'm Karl Adams, Organizational Development and Training Officer for the City of Madison. I was part of a a group that was part of a group that was asked to come together and put out potential models or for public participation. And based on that, what you have in front of you and what's available to the people in the audience as well is two pieces. One is an overview which looks at the purpose for the task force on government structure. Again, reviewing the city's current government structure, assessing governance models and practices of other cities of similar population and statutory requirements. Reviewing best practices for assuring municipal decision makers are representative of, connected to, and accountable to all members of the community, and then making recommendations for improvements it feels are needed. We see this process as being one, in talking to the committee, a small planning group anyway, that part of the thing is there potentially be two phases of this, one being one where we go out and gather insights from people, and then in the second phase, once some recommendations are out there in terms of potential models, that we come back again and get more participation, public insight into recommendations made by the committee as well. So those two phases would be there. And again, if you look at the draft framework, and then this is again just meant to be a starting point for initial dialogue on this topic. The key question, I think, that again in the planning of this is that how do we want to be governed is the question, I think, that the task force has been asked to sort of pull together, and then also to gather insight from the public on that point. And there'd be a kind of a three steps involved in this. One would be this idea of, again, as a framework, informing people, creating awareness of what the issues are, what the needs are. You see that there. And the second piece would be then looking at how do we consult, obtain from the public feedback in a variety of different ways. And, you know, we'd be multiple ways of doing that. One, not only just from public meetings, but also looking at things like websites, a variety of other techniques that we could follow there. You can see in the awareness campaign, for example, in the beginning, we got to inform, consult, and then involve people in coming up with solutions and ideas. And again, seeking from the public what kind of inputs they may have for us in terms of this governance models that we bring forward. So again, with that, if people have questions in terms of looking at on this document or this draft framework, this is one approach that we could take, and we could certainly gather more from people. And I, with the planning group, some of the members are here, we'll certainly take notes from any insights that the public might have on how they might want to add to that, or if the committee would like to have questions on this as well.
Karl, did you or members of the task force and others, would it be useful to sort of walk through this, I think? And
yeah,
so why don't you walk us through, and we can certainly stop and talk and ask questions. And
yeah, okay. If we look at this kind of informing stage in the framework, here again, this is where we're trying to get information out to create awareness of issues around there. This awareness campaign, for example, would look at creating a website with links that the Mayor and Common Council would link to the Mayor and Common Council's website. We currently have a system in place in the city which is called My Account, where you can subscribe, for example, so people could subscribe to this and get feeds coming to them when they need it, you know, kind of keep informed that way through the website. And then we'd looked at social media kinds of things like Facebook and Twitter and other kinds of things. This we'd have to sort of walk through with the city's IT group and kind of establish some of those kinds of things. But that would be, again, one of the ways. So the website would be one way to get creation, and again, get people to interact with that particular website through the My Account process.
could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
On this My Account option, we're presently, the city is using that now.
Yeah.
And people sign up and they can get a feed.
Right.
How widely used is that?
That's a good question. I would say we have, I would not know the exact number of that, but I could certainly find that out for the committee.
Hundreds, thousands?
Yeah, hundreds, but, yeah,
Thousands.
and,
Thousands?
yeah, it could
Somewhere
well,
between hundreds
could
and
well be
thousands.
thousands, yes. I
Individual
agree with
alder
that.
has
13 has
thousands.
hundreds.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
has almost, yeah.
Because again, in other online things that we've done with community budget conversations, for example, that the web seems to be a way that many people interact with the city now, and we usually would get, where we may have a couple hundred people attend the community budget conversation meetings, we'd certainly have thousands of people do things online and, you know, put in information and ideas online, so.
Do people sign up by district? So could we take a look at the distribution?
We can take a look at that, we can take a look at that number, and we can take a look at if we got any demographics that would tell us that. Because they could potentially identify, here's the blog I want to hear, you know, those kinds of things, so that might tell us the district. So there's some elements there, yeah.
I just had a question. I get maybe 2 to 3 times a week a little notice from my alderman. I can't recall ever really signing up for that, but I
Yep.
started getting it, and I get it
Yep.
regularly.
Yep.
That's different from this. And how is that? I mean, I think that's a pretty good method of communication.
Yeah.
At least it's a one-way communication.
Right.
So
And one of the
it-
ways it differs is that the alders create listservs that they have, and then they can send out to their district areas, so that's part of what each alder is doing. And maybe the alders could speak to how they generate those names from their end, but it's basically the alders can create that for their own district, because they want to get the information out as well to their constituent groups.
I think part of the challenge is that, at least from my perspective as an alder, we have our own listservs, and different alders use their listservs to different degrees to share different amounts of information. So it's not consistent. If you're only
Right.
signed up for your alder's listserv, you may or may not get information depending on what district you live in. And then there are the city updates that don't necessarily go out through all the alders listservs as well. So I think it's good, Carl, that you identified all of these different things on here, because they are not, there may be overlap between people getting multiple of these channels, but they are separate channels. And I mean, email blasting is an easy way to
Right.
just do that for everyone, but it's certainly not gonna,
Well, one of the things
Get
that
everyone.
the city often has challenges with is this idea of marketing, which again, in most organizations, there's a marketing division, a marketing department, marketing entities. We have public information officers in several divisions who sort of specialize in getting information out. We could certainly work with them, but we don't really have a coordinated marketing, you know, group. So again, how many levels of awareness can we create? And as you can see, some of the things here is it's working with, you know, city channel, public information officers, neighborhood resource teams, you know, all the different ways that we have of, you know, throwing the net out wide in terms of creating awareness. And then I think also potentially if we do this right in terms of a web site, that it would provide more of an interactive way of people getting information to us. Again, there's a lot of different ways we can do it, but again, press releases, other kinds of things, you know, we'd start, you know, let's call it beating the bushes to make sure that everybody understands that it's here and available, and, you know, things like the viewing of this particular video, for example, will be cached so that others could look at it and see what the process is, and we'll create awareness as we go. But that's definitely an important part of the initial startup and getting people, you know, to know that we're looking at this. It's been a while since we've looked at it, and that it's an important initiative over the next year or so.
I know you're not a specialist in marketing, but
Yeah.
can you tell us, how long do you think this phase will take?
The marketing phase, or I mean, we would start hitting that. We've been doing some talking already to the IT group, and we would really try and hit this up within the next month or two. So, yeah.
Okay, thank
I was an old traveling salesperson, so I do know the marketing end of things, but you know, it was in a past life before I came into public service. So, but yeah,
you.
we'd work on that.
I want to note for people who've joined us since the meeting began that we're operating under a suspension of the rules right now. So that will allow persons not on the task force to ask questions and participate in the discussion if you wish.
And again, I think as you can see on the left side here, our promise to the public in this session is, keep them informed on this kind of process. And again, create the awareness that it's there and continue to look at all the avenues we can to get the word out, and to do it in a way also that reaches historically disadvantaged or disenfranchised groups that we want to reach out well to. So, and certainly try and do it in as broad a pattern as we can, and casting that net wide so we can, again, get lots of inputs. The other thing, as we sort of then move from that awareness creation in the next couple of months, it's then also looking at this, what are ways we can consult with people. Again, this is obtaining public feedback, alternatives, and decisions. Taking a look at that is the idea of perhaps having a digital survey or the kinds of things where we could actually assess, use that. This has been a common practice that we've done with things like community budget conversations, lots of different elements that we have with lots of different agencies do this kind of surveying of, to get an idea of service ideas, things like that. So again, we build on that, trying to consult with them and get insights. But again, anything we can do to sort of start the interactive two-way communication in this part of the process. And then part of that too, we've also looked at this idea of having open public forums, open houses, the kinds of things that we, again, aside from a sort of a guided, directed meeting where we get people involved in these forums in the latter part of this process, the other part is to sort of get out to individual focus groups, other kinds of things. We've done some of that with our comprehensive planning process that we've just have been going through, which will sort of culminate in April of this year. But we learned a few things with that process that we can sort of use to enhance this process as well, and build on that process too. So I think those last, when we get to working directly with the public, that would be the kind of thing of having kinds of forums where people are doing much more interactive kinds of things. I mean, how many of you understand the World Cafe model, for example? I think many of you have used that. We've used it with a lot of different agencies in a lot of different venues, but part of that is to really get people to sit with their neighbors, talk about stuff, really, get insights, deeper insights into what they may see as, and again, we could potentially look at some of the things that along with the main question of how do we want to be governed, the awareness of the roles and the responsibilities of the mayor, the council, and committees, boards and commissions, really kind of dig more deeply into that kind of stuff. And again, also this idea of how do you want to interact with your government as well. We definitely have seen, changes in those interactions over the years. And again, how might we diversify that interaction and other kinds of things as we go forward. So the involvement part would be, again, a much more interactive, in-place, direct involvement piece, where the consulting piece might be different things through surveys and other, let's say, indirect ways of doing that kind of stuff. So, but in general, this is a way to start. Sarah?
Yeah, Carl, can you speak to the difference, I can only speak from my experience, but the difference between open houses, briefings and listening sessions, and like World Cafes? Because at least in my experience, and maybe it's just a matter of who shows up to meetings and when you have them in different formats, but I've at least struggled with open houses and getting people to participate, because at least open houses that we've had have been, poster boards around the room type of thing, and people are supposed to mingle between the different places and have a conversation. These are usually in the context of some sort of planning process, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But I found that people kind of stand there and then they're not really sure what they're supposed to do, and they think they're supposed to get a presentation, because we're so used to this typical meeting format where you come in, you sit down, you get a presentation, and then you get to ask Q&A, and then you're done. And so I wonder if you have any examples of how you've seen some of these different formats work well.
I think with an open house or a public forum, a neighborhood plan is a good example, or a park planning process. And the downtown plan, for example, are the plans that we've pull together, if you have the boards and other things out, you know, one of the things is to have somebody there standing next to the board to engage the public as well. It's not as fully directed as you might see in sort of a World Cafe or another type of process like that, but it's also that thing of engaging the public as they're there, and really, you know, talking to people about that, circulating more, that kind of thing. I think it, you know, again, it is a more open kind of format, and again, who do we attract to those kinds of things? And I think that's the difference, is sort of the level of sort of engagement people feel, and that what they want.
Just, John, before we take your comment, I also want to make sure to invite Tarek, Jewel, and Toriana
Yep.
to jump right in on this. And in fact, if you don't mind, why don't you all just sit at the table?
Yeah.
I
invited them, but they were like, "Oh no, you go."
Oh, please.
Yeah.
We'll force
They're
the
shy
situation.
Yeah.
city staff.
And you know, I think what we're doing is going through, if you came into the room after we've started, the rules are suspended so that everybody here is free to participate, and we're working through this draft framework that our colleagues who work for the city have laid out as a way to begin thinking about our work of public engagement. We'll have certainly other ideas too for public engagement coming from members of the task force, members of the public, but this is really a very helpful way to get us started. So,
Can
John.
I add about the open house, actually, since we're on that topic? You know, open house can have very different kind of formats, and they can be fun. If you've heard of community suppers are really an open house. Other cities, I can tell you an example of a comp plan process down in Austin. Not this is a comp plan, but you can have you know, whatever intrigues and the community to come in. So if that means a band, if that means other kind of speakers, you create an atmosphere where people feel welcome to come in, and then at that open house, you can gather other kind of information. And so I wanted to get away of the boards, Sarah, around the room, because you really, you know, if you know and listen to the community of what will bring them through the doors, you can then provide the platform and the plate for them to be able to absorb as well as to give.
And you're Jewel?
I am Jewel, sorry.
Maybe you all could introduce yourselves
Yeah,
to, I know you met everybody else, but I was on Zoom from out of state when you came to our meeting.
I'm Toriana Fairway. I'm the equity coordinator for the City of Madison and the Department of Civil Rights.
Thank you.
My name is Jewel Strike from the Planning Department, and I work in neighborhoods.
And then I'm Tarek Sakaf and work in the mayor's office and coordinate neighborhood resource teams. And so I'll also weigh in on the open house and kind of actually stepping back a little bit into all of this. You know, I think this is really starting out from the standpoint of what are different ways, what are different techniques to go out and talk to people in the community. Lots of different types. I'm a big fan of kind of stepping away from the what and getting down into the how do we do any of that. I mean, there are really inclusive ways to do any of the things that are listed out on here. They're really, you know, the opposite is also true. And so I think hopefully we can have this conversation, talk through some of the techniques and so on, but then also set the stage for some of the deeper questions, which would really, I think, come back to the committee. And this is part of, or the task force is part of what we talked about, the small planning group, is really trying to wrestle with those questions of what is it that folks want to know. So we're starting out with that big question of how do people want to be governed? But really underneath that, what's the information that the task force is interested in getting? What are the questions that they're interested in getting? What's the dynamic that they want to set up? And then from that, really stepping into the, okay, well, what are the most appropriate ways in which to do that? And recognizing there are going to be it's going to be important to do it in a lot of different ways, whatever stage that we're at, whether it's the informing piece, really making sure that we're just getting information out to people, or it's the really inclusive and trying to get involved. The other piece I think that's going to be important within all of this is also recognizing the importance of starting with some of what we already know. And so there have been a lot of city processes and other processes that have gone on. And so we've referenced the comprehensive plan. But within that, there's an area around effective government. And there have been lots and lots and lots of people that have been involved in the comprehensive planning process. And so what have they already said that tie into the very questions that this group might want to know? So I think leveraging and kind of acting on a lot of those different fronts.
I was originally going to ask the question that was very similar to what all of you have just answered, which is effective ways to get people to actually become participants, come to open houses, and you've answered part of that. So I don't have any more questions on that right now.
Have you found one strategy or a couple of strategies that may work well with those populations that are particularly marginalized, those who do not feel like they have agency, that they will be heard, those who have never participated in any kind of public or civic processes that we may want to look at?
There is no one strategy that's going to work best for marginalized communities. And what you really have to do is try a combination of strategies and techniques. We've tried many of those. Every community, especially communities of color, different things are going to speak to them. And so you're going to have to try various different techniques or strategies that's going to speak to those communities. Church groups, going to the churches themselves, or going to meetings that are already existing, going to community gatherings that are already existing, meeting people where they are sometimes is an opportunity. So there's no one opportunity, but we know from the Imagine Madison plan, and I don't want to beat a dead horse to death, but they know what worked and what didn't work. There's transparency in that process. So we have to use data that we have, right? And that's what comes out of a racial equity analysis, is that collecting information that we already have and collecting information from different sources that has already worked and that didn't work, so that we don't have to recreate the wheel with good public participation or bad public participation strategies, right? Or techniques, so that we don't have to recreate the wheel all over again. And so that's one way to kind of look at this. I mean, you guys want to add anything?
Yeah, Tori, thank you. What Tori said is of finding those places. I would also say is look at what's relevant and pushing that out. Is what is relevant to individuals? Because I think if something is relevant, they're going to respond to that. If it's at those locations, if it's working with trusted advocates, as well as going back into what we've already heard from the public and bringing that forth.
I just would add that the idea of trusted advocates is a really good one, and a lot of populations, we've certainly found that, if you feel like, hey, we're coming from the city, we have the answers, that's not the way to approach that. That part of it is to sort of work with the people in the neighborhoods, work with the people in various groups, and I think we have some strategies for that, but again, we'd certainly learn more and do more, in that realm.
And so, kind of on the front of the trusted advocate, I think, and it's going to demonstrate that there's lots of different ways to approach this. Because as much as I am a fan of connecting through folks that already have the relationships and leveraging some of those relationships and connecting with people, I think sometimes part of the problem that we also make is putting too much weight in terms of allowing an entity or an individual to speak for a whole other group of folks. And so that's also really important to recognize and think about how do we do that and avoid tokenism, or even when we're talking about what does community mean. A lot of times when we talk about community and having community hearing, we end up with a lot of staff from community-based organizations, not necessarily talking to residents themselves. And so I think that just kind of gets into the questions of, again, who are we trying to talk to? What does that look like? Certainly going through the folks that have those relationships. So again, going back to what Tori was saying about where are people, where are they already coming out, going and talking to folks at places of worship, at grocery stores, at all these different spots where people are coming is also very, very important, but not kind of setting up that dynamic that can sometimes put too much reliance on an individual to now start speaking for a community too.
Jewel, did you bring those handouts on techniques, that sort of list of techniques that you showed us at the planning meeting?
I'm turning to Carl.
Okay.
So you have Carl brought those.
No, this is the original piece that we have, and we can certainly get that list out.
Because I thought
The
those were
streaming,
really,
yeah.
really helpful.
Yeah.
It was, so when we were planning for this meeting, they brought to us about a 4-page document table
Yeah.
with the name of the technique, what it's good for. There were 4 categories of types of participation, what it's good for, and then an explanation of the technique. That was getting at, Sarah, some of your questions. And there's probably 2-3 dozen of them. I think that would be a really great resource for all of us to have in front of us.
We
to
could
look
send
at.
that out to on Monday to
Okay.
everybody.
And also, and put that in Legistar, and put this in Legistar too, this document. I noticed there's no live links on our agenda for info, except at the, or well, there's one at the end that says documents. But it would be helpful if they could be attached to the actual item number for easy reference.
Yeah, thanks for this information. And a lot of what I'm seeing and hearing, how you doing, Tree? It's very much reminiscent of similar models that I've seen. And I think that the tool and the how, and I think, Tarek, you said something about this, the tool is important, but what you do with the information is also equally, if not more, important. And I'd venture to say that sometimes a method of improving community engagement might be honoring that community participation past the level of recommendation, so that folks who are participating see real value in their participation, and we sort of mitigate in an honest way the jadedness that you get when folks are like, come to this meeting or participate in this group and, you know, let your voice be heard. So I'm wondering, with your models and your experience, how, if at all, you've been able to use the information that you're gaining from the folks that you're engaging, and if you've seen that be improve participation.
So again, my role is with the neighborhood resource teams, which basically, for folks that don't know, start off as folks from different departments in city staff coming together, working with residents and primarily staff from other community-based organizations in certain neighborhoods. And the whole idea is to really make sure that we're tuning into the needs, the issues, and priorities of folks in the neighborhoods and then responding appropriately. So a lot of the focus of my work is really around community engagement. I think the whole point kind of developed these ideas of these 5 R's of really authentic community engagement, which go with like really starting off with just basic value of respect and valuing relationships, being receptive to what people have to say, being responsive once they've told you. And then the real one to me is the last one, which is being real. And so I think part of what that means is when we're having the conversations, regardless of who comes there, being very upfront with what the agenda is, what's on the table, what's not on the table, how the process is going to work, what that feedback loop is going to look like, and where it can actually influence some things and not. With the neighborhood resource teams, we've done a lot of different types of techniques. So that's been the community suppers, it's been small focus groups, it's been going out, showing up where people are and having a series of conversations with lots of people out there, different versions of surveying. And what we've done then with that is translate that into the recommendations that have gone on and informed different things that have shown up in the city budget. The next piece has been going out and trying to make sure that we're connecting back with people in the community to say, okay, this is what we talked about, and this is what we were actually able to do with that. I don't know necessarily that breeds more and more participation, but I think what it has resulted in is more trust, with different individuals. And so there's more willingness to share and participate in different ways in the future, or pull somebody else that they know into a process, or involve them in a conversation. So.
Well, through the Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative, when we enter into racial equity analysis, I can give you one example, which was the Brittingham Park example, where the community actually came to us. In that particular case, we had a playground, which was a barrier-free playground that was going to go into Brittingham Park. And no one had an issue with the barrier-free park being erected and going into the park. However, the Hmong community raised an issue with about 400 feet away. There was another play structure that was in question next to the community gardens that was going to be removed because it was at the end of its usefulness. And the Parks Department felt that it needed to come down because there was this new play structure that was going to go up that was going to be much nicer. It was going to serve the needs of that end of the park. There was another playground that was going to be improved over by the boats area, and the one next to the community gardens was going to come down because it was at the end of its life cycle, and it was falling apart. The Hmong community came to us and said, hey, our elders use this play structure as they garden, and we need this structure to stay here. Matter of fact, not only do we need it for it to stay here, we need for it to be improved. That park was intended to have an improvement made to it, but it was going to be a nature-based play. So the actual structure was going to come down, but it was going to be a nature-based play type of structure to kind of mimic the garden activity. Community was not happy with that. They came to us and they said, hey, do a racial equity analysis. So to get to your question, transparency was through that whole process. There were parameters, there were very limited things that we could be able to provide back to the community as far as what could happen, because there was a huge investment that was going to take place with the barrier-free park. And so Parks was very transparent as to what could happen. There was a lot of negotiation going back and forth. We held one meeting. We gave the community the opportunity to tell us what they wanted. There was lots of transparency in that meeting. We communicated with the community in the language that they needed, Spanish and in Hmong. We provided translation services, both in Spanish and Hmong. The kids got to communicate with us. The elders got to communicate with us in their language, very comfortably in their language. And we heard from them. The Parks Department came back 3 different times after we met that first time and gave them the parameters in which they were able to say, hey, this is what we can work with. Here's the material as far as the park is concerned that the play structure can be erected. Here's the color, here's the equipment. What color would you like within these parameters? What type of equipment would you like within these parameters? And the kids got to pick that out. But in between those meetings, it wasn't the smoothest, because there was transparency. But they got to tell us we did not like the initial decision, but there was collaboration between both ways. And that's transparent. That is public participation as it's supposed to be, right? And so that's accountability as well. Because on the racial equity analysis, it says who's accountable. The parks person in that department, the leader, is accountable, and he did his job very well. He came back to the community and said, this is what I'm accountable to. This is what I can work with. I heard your concerns. I'm taking your recommendations very seriously. This is what I can do. And it doesn't always work like that. You know what I'm saying? This government don't always have the ability to address every recommendations. But when we can, that's what we try to do. And the Racial Equity Initiative played neutral in that process as a mediator to say, hey, we heard your concerns and we want to be able to help assist with a very real issue for a community that needed that space to be maintained.
Thank you.
Just to add a little bit too, I think one of the other issues that the committee should think about is the decision-making process that you would go through, right? Because let's say we have meetings, we have inputs coming in, staff can potentially help compile information, other kinds of things, provide it to you, but then, what's your process of going through and deciding on that kind of stuff? And then, again, how does that dialogue happen? To what level in terms of transparent, you don't want consolidation, you want to see the raw stuff, or you want to see raw stuff plus consolidation, plus first views, those kinds of things. So I think it's worthwhile for you to think about what is our decision-making process on this, or maybe the logic model even that you kind of go through and take a look at this, and how do we compare it, again, do certain things get us in the right direction? Are we flexible, or, are we getting some return on, fiscal, environmental, social, other kinds of things? Does it help you get further down the path that you want to do? So I think it's worthwhile for you to also think about, let's say we help gather information at a meeting, and then what do we do with that? How do you want to see it? What level do you want in terms of filtering, if any? And maybe that is a topic that you want to think about, that process of analysis and filtering and decision making. So,
How does that process take place with your model now? The analysis, the filtering, is that a software that you use? Is that someone, a person that reviews statements and categorizes? Yeah,
it's done. Well, it can be done. More often than not, it's done by a team of people looking at the information and sort of compiling. That you get the subject matter experts who have helped with the process, and they compile it together and then present it to a decision-making body to do something with that.
So Eric, within your question, as you're talking about within this model, I want to be clear, we're not proposing a model, or there's not kind of a model of community engagement I think that any of us are talking about. It's really started out with the premise of just trying to run through a series of different types of techniques. And so I think, depending on who's doing what that, even to your question, that might look different depending on whatever particular process each, particular venture is kind of set out upon. So within the neighborhood resource teams, we kind of do things one way. With one particular racial equity analysis, it might be done a different way. Another racial equity analysis might be done a third way. So none of this is really proposing this is a model of community engagement. I think it's much more for public participation. It's much more laying out, these are some of the techniques, these are some of the things for the task force to be mindful of, and things for you all to consider when you step into this process. Just want to be clear on that.
Tariq, you talked about neighborhood resource teams. Can you tell a story about one time that a neighborhood resource team effectively engaged people in a neighborhood on a question or an issue where the people in the neighborhood would probably say, we were heard?
Yeah, so this is one of the smallest examples, so kind of start out again with that bigger picture question of just what are the needs, what are the issues, what are the priorities for folks that are in particular neighborhoods. So a couple of years ago we were working, still are working, but we went out and did a series of different conversations with folks in the communities, several different ways, in the Balsam-Russet area, in the Meadowwood area. So some of that was going out and engaging with folks at the Let's Eat Out events. So community carts were coming out, and we had a lot of conversations with just people that were coming out to that. And then it was also trying to make more intentional effort to talk to some of the young people in the neighborhood. So we had a couple conversations at the neighborhood center with folks, with young folks that were coming out to the neighborhood center. And one of the things that came up was just not liking the bounce of the ball on the rim when the kids were playing basketball. And there are reasons why the Parks Department had put in a double rim, but ultimately the way that translated was kind of ruined the game for the kids that were playing. And so that was a very easy thing to act on, but we heard it, we passed it along. The rims were changed within like a week, and the kids knew it was because they said something, you know, and that resonated. So that's the smallest level. I mean, there have been a lot of bigger ones, but that to me is really, I think, when I'm asked about what do some of the success stories look like within neighborhood resource teams, that's one of the most meaningful to me because it's just so straight in terms of someone saying, this is a problem for us. And it's something within our ability to actually affect and do something about. And we know that, and they know that, and then they saw that we did it.
Thank you.
Would you mind, Tarek, if I put you on the spot a little bit to share one of those bigger examples?
Yeah, so one of the really big ones that kind of got things kicked off is really much more, I mean, the neighborhood resource teams are the most effective when folks from the community are interacting with them. So early in Mayor Sogalin's kind of most recent go-around where he got the neighborhood resource teams up and going again, one of the big issues in Madison has been the lack of bus service out to Owl Creek, just very isolated community. And so that's been known for a long time. People have known it, people have felt it, people have articulated it in lots of different ways. Neighborhood resource team finally got established out there in 2011 or so. Group of teens from Senate Middle School and La Follette High School started talking about this with their, I think some of the school staff. They interacted with the neighborhood resource team, had some conversations about how this was a real need. Metro is involved on the teams, and so they heard some of that, crafted a proposal to try and expand it. And then there were all the layers of kind of politics that came back and forth. And so first there was inclusion of a new route to serve Owl Creek. And I'm not sure on the exact details of this, but it was proposed by Metro. I think it was adopted and then it got taken out. But the joint really leverage of the recommendations coming from the neighborhood resource team now, from the youth that actually were able to come out to the Common Council meetings and advocate for this, ultimately resulted in a route getting created. And then after that, there are a series of continued conversations that went on after that, again into the community to finally, once that route got established, to expand it and get more hours added to it. And actually Metro started using that as more and more of a plug-in as they sought to expand routes in other areas of town and try to become, I guess, more whole in some of the services that they provided.
Thank you.
I could tell you a little experience of what my role is in the city. And so I work with neighborhoods to develop neighborhood plans, in which I look at it, it's a strategic, looking in the future, 10 years, what the neighborhood would like to accomplish. So it is really led by neighborhood residents. And so as I look at somebody coming in from the city, one of the things that we really need to do is listen. You know, get out of the way and just listen to what is really important and relevant to the community at that point in time. And by doing that listening, we know what those priorities are. And that then gets embedded into the strategy, that 10-year strategy. And so one of the things that we're really clear about is through this process, and I think that's being honest, is what can we do and what can't we do? What can fit into this planning process, what can't, and if it can't, where else could it be? You know, so giving that opportunity and what that pathway is for if the neighborhood is really, if that is a priority, how can the neighborhood see that accomplished by advocating that elsewhere? We also look at pace. You know, coming in and saying we are going to do this in 3 months or 6 months or 8 months. The community may not be able to do that in 3 months, 6 months or 8 months. And so really taking taking note of that is what is the pace of the community and not necessarily the pace of, I'll look at our department, the neighborhood planning process. And then also looking at ways in which we can get out of the way. Who should be leading that and taking responsibility and accountability of getting things done? Because that's what really buy-in is, and that's really is what really shows the neighborhood wants, is if they're part of that is and in that leadership role of getting that accomplished. So one of the things that I always look at in the neighborhood planning process is at the end of the day, if neighbors are up presenting what's in their plan, I think that's a lot more authentic. An example of the previous, or our last planning process was in the Darbo-Worthington neighborhood. And one of the things that came out was we want fresher food within our neighborhood. And how can we get that from where we are? And we looked at, bus transportation, how you walk to the full service grocery stores. But one of the ideas from a resident was, let's start something in the Darbo area in which has fresh food. So there was a neighborhood resident that led that, brought in some other partners and other residents, but then it matured into also is people in the neighborhood can make things or do things. And so not only are we going to have a market, we are going to provide these locally made items or these services and offer those also, no matter what age, because it was little kids to older. But to me, we got out of the way. That was done by the neighborhood, and that wasn't really led by anybody other than the neighborhood to accomplish that.
Yes. Would you introduce yourself?
My name is Marilyn Pickett, and I'm sorry.
Can you, yeah. Thanks, Marilyn.
Thank you, Professor. Remember me?
Yes, I do.
My name is Marilyn Pickett.
She was a star student the first year I taught policy.
Professor.
Yeah.
Let's see, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, and I'm sorry that I spoke out of turn at your last meeting. That won't happen again. I was just curious. I always am curious about things, and it seems like what you folks are doing with the resource teams and the neighborhood centers and getting these communities engaged, how does that interface then with this larger group? I mean, it seems like wonderful things are being done with engaging the community, different communities. And so how is this, will this enhance that? Or that was just a question that I had.
That's a good question for us, I think. Thanks, Marilee. Please come forward and use the microphone, and if you don't mind introducing yourself to us, that would be great.
Yes, my name is John Brown, and I'm a representative of the African American communities, and I have dealt with all the African American communities in Madison in the last 2 years, and most of my friends and associates from life. And this is a big structure of a service to be unaware of the public. I also do surveys, and I've never seen a survey come through the communities that even give word that this structure is being built. So I would like to participate in this structure, but what if this structure is to the betterment of the people? How do this structure help the people? How do it really help me? I did 20 years in prison without 2 years. Now I'm back into my community on the south side. So how do this structure help me get them to understand a practice that they don't understand? Most of us can't read. We pick to say white folks give us problems. So how could a service come in a black community that we feel the service has hindered us? SSI, Child Support Services, the DOC. How could this be a service to say that it's not the same service that all other services played in the community? That's what my people want to know. How can we trust this system of services and not blame it on the county? If this system don't work, we're going to blame it on the county. So how can we not let this system fail? Because we're going to believe that the county did it. And I come to find out it's not the county. It's a service being presented into the county. So how could this service bring awareness to the people and don't be a failure on that awareness? Because we have many services going at that money of housing. So how can we not know that this is a joke because of the price of the money and the need to help the people? So that's what I want to know when I go back to the community and say, we do got help. We have this service. We have that service. We have Deacon Save, food pantries. That's most our interest. Service of needs now. You know. But I like this service, but I don't understand how this service play a part in Black Lives Matter, the children's addictions, things that we having a problem with right now. You can put us anywhere, but you don't take away our behaviors, we're going to build another service. So I'm trying to see, how could I help my people's behaviors and understand that we are someone, then we are not. And that's what we're dealing with the black communities. We're ready to change, but we don't know how to change. And everything we get to change for, change us in ways we don't like. So how could this service, this is a huge service you have. How could you put this service together? Because it's needed for the people. How could you put this service together as a whole? And like you say, you do walks through the community, this and that. I would also like to take walks through the community and tell them that we have something at last. But I can't take a walk with something I don't know what's behind it. So I haven't got enough from this service to tell the people that this service can do what other service can't. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Karl Adams. I spoke at your first launch meeting when you were remote, and as I've said, I'm delighted at this task force and what it's about. And I'm delighted you chose tonight's location, 100 feet from where I grew up, up the street on Wabisa, and facing the street named after fighting Bob La Follette, who created this, or was responsible for getting this state called America's Laboratory of Democracy. I want to build on that here in Madison and model that. And even the street, Wabisa, is an Ojibwe name for swan. Can we find a more elegant, swans represent elegance and strength and beauty. Can we build on that and take our obsession with information and turn it into wisdom, and take our public input processes, both giving and receiving, and move from pampering whims of the ego as opposed to fundamental needs of the soul. As a recovering left brain analytic engineer, I can rationalize anything with my head, and I did, and it was a disaster, especially when I tried to fix interpersonal issues and with my head, my left brain. I believe we need a balance, or I've had to survive, and I've been through a massive meltdown. I've had to find balance between left brain, right brain, head and heart, self and other, ego and soul, because they both have their place. It depends on who's in the driver's seat. And I've been involved in a vast range of governance models, from local neighborhoods to corporations to living communities and so on. I've explored various models of consensus around the country, even internationally, and including other cultures that are radically different in ways of being, doing, knowing, relating, and resolving. And I'm experimenting with many now here in my roots. I'm a co-chair of Friends of Starkweather, working with both nature and people for win-win ways to heal each other and serve each other and beyond the whims that if I ask, what do you want, what do you need, well, I get overwhelmed in all kinds of information and data and whims that I can drown. And as a recovering rescuer of damsels in distress and people hurting, I've had to find ways to be extremely discerning in how to serve without fixing or interfering. Including, I'm heavily involved in the Darby-Worthington area wearing many hats, and it's been humbling how hard that neighborhood is and how many competing factions there are, and many based on wounds and fears and anger that are very difficult to hear because you have to gain huge trust and before people are going to really share deeply. That's been very hard and humbling, and I'm still doing that. But even here in this building is one of the most promising vehicles to make that connection. There are weekly drum circles that I've seen connect very, very diverse people through this unorthodox but very fundamental tribal vehicle of drum and dance and chant that transcends left brain ego, especially when we do it outside around fire on Picnic Point, for instance. So you'll be hearing more from me on this over time. I'm heavily invested in this. And in fact, I'm running down the hall to a rehearsal for another alternative, using the vehicle of dance and creative expression for tomorrow's March for Our Lives is another way to express through another ways the pain we have and the fear about gun violence. So if you're finish early or get bored, come down the hall and dance and drum with me.
And we'll see you there tomorrow.
What's that?
I said, we'll see you there tomorrow, and thank you. In the interest of time, we're going to move on,
way
but,
beyond my normal time.
well, you know, but thank you for your contributions.
Thank you for allowing me.
You bet.
I honor all of you.
Other questions, comments from the task force before I try to sort of circle our, John?
In this act, if you choose not to respond to this at this point, I know one of the things that struggle with me is this. If you look at our charge, it's incredibly broad. It's also incredibly dull to most of the people living in most of the communities in terms of recommending what we do about any one of those things. I thought maybe I'd pick one of the things and ask you how we would go about getting community involvement in that issue. And let's say the number of alders in the city of Madison. I mean, or take the veto power, whatever it happens to be easy for you to answer off the top of your head. Give us some ways that we could involve those who wouldn't otherwise be involved in caring about this to get involved in telling us what they really think. If they had been engaged in it. I understand people being involved in an issue. Issues always bring people together, and they come and they speak and they have opinions. The playground, or the basketball hoop. But absent them knowing that this is an issue, how do we get them involved so they recognize the issue and then give us their ideas?
To that, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. So thank you for your input. And I saw, so there are a few questions that we got here, and one of them was how, I guess, something about the scope of this process and like how it was supposed to connect to how the public was supposed to engage or what the result was supposed to be. If I'm looking at you because I'm trying to see if I understood your question the right way. Marilee. Okay, Marilee. I apologize. I didn't remember your name. Your question was about what is supposed to come out of this task force?
Yes. Well, I don't know now. I'm getting clarity on my own question.
Okay, okay, great.
I heard her ask, how does what they presented to us relate to us?
Okay,
So
right.
right, that's what I heard. Is that more or less? How does what they presented about NRTs and RESG relate to our work?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for that. And then I heard a question about how what we're doing here applies to specific needs in the community that are going unmet currently, and how the public can be engaged with certain barriers to participation. So it's my understanding that the tools and methods that were being shared are options for this task force to deploy to get feedback and input and leadership from the community to address the issue of local government and the powers of common council as it relates to the mayor and, you know, policies in that area. So they're giving us ideas of how to get community voice into this process. I see heads nodding, so I feel like I'm representing that correctly. And then when it comes to how does this connect to specific needs that we have in our community, and how does this, basically what I hear your question being in the back there is, how does this actually matter? I'm sorry?
John, you talking about John?
Yes. The representative of African American community, a representative. Thank you for that. And I hear your question being, how does this matter to folks that have needs, basically? And so from my understanding, these things matter to the extent that they can actually result in real change for people that are going through they're having issues that can be improved or changed by local government. So maybe it is some level of assistance. Maybe it's transit to a specific area. And perhaps the community in that area is suffering because there's no transit. And if they had stronger voice or participation or a better way than our current way to operate and influence government, perhaps that need would get met quicker. And we get that bus, or we get that different type of assistance, or we get that store in the community that needs that access to healthy food. I'm not sure when this task force is going to share options or ideas for community engagement, but it sounds like if we're suspending the rules, this might be an option for me to share in answering these two questions, an idea that some of you are already aware of. And in full disclosure, this is an initiative that I've been working on very closely for the better part of a couple of years now. But the purpose of it is to elevate the voice of those that are most impacted by whatever issues we're trying to solve.
Eric, can I ask you to hold for 1 minute? Because I think
Sure.
what I'm hearing is that you have an idea that you want to share.
Mm-hmm.
And before we move to that, John had a question, I think, that he asked that was more pointed of this group. That was on,
Mine was just looking for ideas from the panel that's sitting here, or anybody who's out there. You know, how are we going to motivate people to become involved in this process about issues that are really important to them, but that aren't really very exciting until something happens? And we'd like to see the engagement, participation happen before it becomes an issue.
so really your question also is to Eric. I mean, I think Eric,
Sure.
in a certain
Yeah.
sense, Eric is also coming
All
forward
right, yeah,
with some
anybody on
thoughts
this
in
panel?
response to that question.
Yeah.
Okay. Got
So
it.
one of the issues with motivation is that there's no real, and I mentioned this to Tarek earlier, there's no real accountability of the result. And in my participation and organizations that I've worked with the Imagine Madison planning process, the community panel approach of let's get leaders to work with their communities and get feedback as to what this comprehensive plan should look like. the participants were less likely to engage because they had the idea that the city they already had their mind made up what the plan was going to be. And so this was sort of a formality to say, yes, we did engage the community. We spent months engaging the community and empowered community leaders to gather their groups, and we honored that feedback. But folks they were not convinced that their feedback and their input would actually make it into the plan, which is why I asked about the synthesizing process, because that is where you take community voice and turn it into a plan. And if that person or group of people are not connected to that issue, things are going to get lost in the translation. And people who have any kind of inkling that that's going to happen are less likely to take time off of work, take 2 buses, and spend their life engaging in a process that's not going to result in anything for them. So being able to show that accountability and to report back and say, hey, we heard you, this is what we heard, was it what we thought we heard, was it what you said, and this is a result, the concrete result that came from that, that in and of itself is a motivator, at least in the groups that we've talked to, in participating further, seeing that my voice actually matters here, and it's not just here because people need to make sure that they're, crossing their I's and dotting their T's. So that's one of the, and having methods and processes that make that more of a reality and make that accountability more of a reality have also shown increased public engagement and participation. So processes where there's real teeth in the process and the voice is being elevated and people aren't overshadowed. So I still don't know if this is the time to share that, but I do feel like it applies. Is there another? Okay.
No, I think go ahead. Brenda,
I'll wait.
do you want? Okay, good.
Okay. Are you sure?
Can I weigh in on John's question?
Sure.
So just directly to that, I mean, you're talking about how do you get folks interested in a question that's maybe not that interesting, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, this isn't a fair answer in some ways, but that's a really important thing for this body to reflect on.
Yeah.
That's kind of the point. It goes to Julie was talking about relevance earlier. And how do you balance that when there are other kinds of things that people might be caring much more deeply about? I think ultimately, if you ask someone about a question about veto powers, they might not be that interested. But if you go deeper to and there are a lot of pieces. I mean, the base question around this is, as Alder Kemble has put it, how do people want to be governed? And if you go deeper than that, what is it that's important to people about how their governments work for them? And so there are places where you can connect with people around what are the shared values? What are their ambitions? I mean, some of the things that Karl was talking about, what is it that is really important and resonates for people in deeper ways? So that doesn't translate into a conversation about trying to find out what people think about veto powers. It goes to, I mean, frankly, what Eric's talking about, an accountability. How does government operate? Who does what? What happens when people don't do what they're going to say? What does that look like? So I think there are ways to have deeper conversations that invite people into a meaningful process. I think the other piece is to really recognize all the different layers of which public participation operates. When do you do it? When is it going to be real? When is it going to matter to people? And also recognizing that this body in and of itself, with community members involved, is one layer of public participation. So even what's the responsibility of this body in terms of trying to vet some of those questions beforehand. So,
Alder Kemble?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I just want to emphasize that the base question here is how do we collectively want to be governed in this city? And for us to decide what are the best decision-making processes that would align with those ways we want to be governed. And we were kind of joking in the prep meeting about, well, we can't, ask that question. People say, I want a monarchy. Well, I think it's okay. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the values that someone has where they would want to be a monarchy. We can't legally be a monarchy, but we can address the sort of impulses, underneath that
that people saying we want to be a monarchy. So each one of us was selected to be on this task force by either the mayor or the council president for a reason, for who we are and what we bring to this. And I think we need to put our creative thinking caps on and together figure out really interesting ways to ask that question to the whole city. You know, we're not dealing with just a neighborhood, not dealing with just one issue, but the whole city, and find new and different ways to listen to what people say around that really interesting question. Because I think people, you know, we can find a way to make this interesting to pretty much anyone. And we can find ways to address, like, Eric, the issue you just brought up about, you know, where's the accountability? Like, there's a particular part in our charge where that's a big problem, and that is the powers of committees. You know, that is open to us to give recommendations on. It's all open to us. So I think we have to do some real work in coming up with ways to make the questions interesting and, you know, not just relevant to people, but really strategically pointed to the charge of this committee and the issues we're being asked to develop recommendations on.
Alder Carter?
I just want to say, getting back to John's comments, that piggybacking on you, Rebecca, is the structure might also align with the services that you mentioned, that when you go out and talk to people. So we can't just put things in little boxes and then go into that box when it's the appropriate time. This all interconnects in the end. So I think that some of the things that you talk about is something that might come out when we're done with this committee.
Right, and one of the areas we're not there yet, because we're just talking about how we're going to participate, and we haven't gotten to the part of what are the issues you're going to address over the course of the year, the charge of the resolution. But getting back to your question, one of the ways to deal with difficult questions, or how do you get people to engage, really is, what are people struggling with? What are the things that are most near and dear to our marginalized communities, or people of color, or our low-income communities? Not necessarily why and how are they not navigating government, but what are the indicators in our community that we're already seeing gaping disparities, and what are they in crisis about? Those are things that people are struggling with in our communities, and these are things that I guarantee you people probably want to talk about, that maybe government is addressing and maybe government is not. And in their own circles, in their own communities, they probably are talking about somewhere, right? And so our goal, or maybe quest, is how do we get them to talk to us? Possibly, right? How do we navigate that? And that goes back to your question, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But those are some of the challenges that we face. But these are also some of the inequities and disparities and barriers that we are trying to address in government, because that makes our community more sustainable for all of our residents in the city.
Carl, and then Maggie.
Hi, Maggie. I was just going to add on to what people have said about that. I think you're going to find people will be very interested in Madison. I mean, we talked about 101, 102 maybe plus committees.
200.
Yeah, we may be closer. We have 585 people, I think, was what we talked about on Monday. And again, I think the thing we have to be sort of conscious of is how do we get to hear more of those voices, right? There'll be people who be engaged in certain parts of it. I think that we also want to diversify and look at all kinds of opportunities to get that input as we go forward, because I do think that, you know, the feel of the city, how well they feel like they're represented, you know, is it a quality place to live, right? Do we feel like, you know, why do we choose to live here? Why do we want to live here? You know, these are all things that, you know, government helps inform. And the other thing I think that we think about is that it's not only the work of this, you know, today, right? It's the next generation that public sector has to take care of too. So I think that's the other piece of, you know, people providing us insights into the things that they feel like governance needs to do for them now, but it's also what's going to do for their kids, other kinds of things.
So let's have Maggie, Brenda, Justice, and then back to Eric for his idea.
Thank you for saying that, because that was part of what I was, in a way, going to talk about. Maybe not exactly, but let's keep in mind that this, the way I see it, should be a discussion too, just to ensure that we have that trust and transparency, because simply listening is not always the solution. And sometimes we will hear things that we know are wrong, morally, ethically, and legally wrong. So responding to that and keeping it transparent and saying, we hear what you're saying, but these may be some of the consequences of the things that are important to you, so people know when they're advocating for something that it may lead to those consequences for others that they may not be aware of. And I feel like that's important for us as a task force to keep in mind.
Justice?
I thought it was Brenda.
Brenda? It was a, it was a test. You were listening, yes.
It's really hard to know where to start, because I've been involved with local government since 1994. I got appointed to a committee then. 2001, I was on the city council, and in 2005, I was the council president. So I've been on I was on the council for 8 years. I was an activist before I was on the council, and I'm an activist now. And I have to say, I feel like there's some things missing from the conversation that I want to make sure get put out there on the table. But when I was council president, I was very much interested in public input and how we were going to improve our structure. And I actually held public hearings around the city. I wasn't supposed to do that because I didn't have the authority to, but I did it anyways, or what, you know. And part of what I find about this is super frustrating to me is that when you listen to people who have been in City Hall for a long time, they complain about the number of committees, they complain about how many people, you know, they have to find to be appointed to those committees. You know, somebody has to staff them, all this stuff. But to me, that is the best thing about our government, if it's used properly. And I think that we have this culture of telling the committees, you can't do that, you can't do that, you're just advisory, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. No, you can do a lot if you're on those committees, but people aren't telling people how to use those committees to move things forward. If I'm on a committee, say, you know, 1994, I was on a committee about Section 8. There was 2 alders on that committee with me. We put forward proposals. The alders introduced them to the council. They referred them out to committees, and all of a sudden people are talking about it. People need to know how to use the government structure to forward something, and they don't. And nobody is going to tell people how to do that either. There's a real issue about power that is missing from this conversation. And if I would have been giving the presentation on Monday, you would have heard completely different things from me than what you would have heard, than what you heard. And I feel like somehow things are out of balance. And somewhere around 2008, 2009, I feel like there was a real effort and sort of like squashing public input. Like alders started to just disdain the public. It took too long. We don't want to hear from them. It's just those people that person organized. We don't want to hear from them. So you can say you find a trusted advocate and bring them to a meeting, but if the alders are like, we don't care because that's just so-and-so and her friends, right? So I feel like there's a lot missing in this discussion, and a lot of it comes from the attitude and the cultural change that happened in City Hall in the last 15, 20 years. And I feel like somehow those issues have to make it onto the table. I actually don't think there's anything wrong with the structure. I think there's a problem with how people are told to use the structure. I mean, part of it is we have to use language. I think Eric said it at the last meeting, but we have to use language that makes sense to people, this Robert's Rules of Order, like, if you don't know Robert's Rules of Order, how could you ever serve on a committee? You know, it turns out nobody on the committee knows how to use Robert's Rules of Order, right? But people are intimidated by that. They think that they can't somehow participate because they don't know the rules. I tell you, at least 3 times a week, somebody calls me or emails me or texts me or Facebooks me and says, I want to do this, how do I do it? And there's nothing you can find anywhere that tells you how to get something done, right? Like, I've tried. I kind of wrote a local government guide for Progressive Dane. It was a start. It's not finished. But people don't even know how to begin to make a difference. They might know to call their alder, but if their alder has that and 500 other issues on their plate, they're not going to get to your one issue that is important to you. And I feel like what we don't want to be having less committees and less people serving on committees. We want to actually have more or a way for people to get their ideas into a system. And we can't do something like we did in the budget process a few years ago where we had people just gave all their ideas about what should be what are our priorities for the budget. Something really important to everybody, affordable housing, top of the list. What did the council do for affordable housing that year in the budget? Nothing, right? So if you get this input and you do nothing with it, people will stop participating. So there's like all kinds of other things going on here, right? And I hear we can't find anybody to serve on committees. Well, there's lots of rules about who serves on committees around here that are not written down. Oh, you're from the 2nd or 6th district. We have too many of you people. We can't do that, so you're not going to get appointed. Oh, you lost your last election. You're not going to get appointed. Oh, you're a former alder. You're not going to get appointed. Like, there's all kinds of people who actually want to be on some of these committees, and they're the last people who are going to get appointed, perhaps because they know how the process works and how they can get things done. I'm not talking about myself when I say that. I'm talking about other. I could give you a list of 40 people who would love to sit on city committees but won't get appointed for whatever the unwritten rules are, and they seem to change over time. It changes with who the mayor is. It changes with all kinds of different things. But if you're going to buy that line that, oh, we can't find enough people to sit on these committees, I don't think that's true at all. And if we told people what they could actually do when they sit on those committees, I think people would find it very interesting, and you'd get lots of volunteers. But someone has to teach people, how do you get a proposal moving? How do you get something going in City Hall? And I answer that question all the time for people, and most people get exhausted and give up. But I feel like there's something really lopsided about how this conversation has gone so far, and I'm not so sure that we're, like, I feel like people are supposed to be fixing something that's broken, but it might not be the structure, it might be our attitude. It might be what we're teaching people, what we're telling people about our structure. And I feel like at that last meeting, my head just wanted to explode because I just felt like it was continuing to clamp down on this, like, oh, our structure is so broken, let's restructure it. We gotta have less committees, we gotta have less alders, we just don't wanna deal with all those people, right? And I think that is absolutely 100% the wrong way to go. The city of Madison is great because of the public input that we get. If you look at it, and you talk to any developer who will tell you the truth, they bring a project forward. The nosy neighborhood gets involved and they get really annoyed. And guess what? At the end of that project, the project is a better project because the neighborhood all got involved. We learn this over and over at Occupy Madison. Like, somebody can bring an idea for it, and if they just do it by themselves, it gets done. But it's not a great product. If you bring it forward and you ask 3 people what they think about it and everybody gives their input, it ends up a better product in the end. Right? Somebody is going to make a sign to put on the wall, and then people start talking about how would it be better, and then all of a sudden it looks like so much better, right? So I feel like, I don't know, I'm really irritated. You can probably tell. But I really feel like I want people to stop and recognize there's 2 things that aren't really being recognized. One is power. And I think people in power are trying to keep their power. And how you structure what you do, what you come up with, what your end result is going to determine who has the power. And right now, people have power in committees. And if you kill committees, people's power goes away. Right? So I think that's one thing. And I think we got to get away from this. Like, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. You're advisory, we can't do this. New York did that, but we can't do this. That's not, we need to go like, this is Madison. There's a lot of really smart people here. let's figure out how to do it, not how not to do it. And I just feel like it's all in our attitude. So I'll be quiet and walk away. I don't know if that was helpful, but it's just
Thank you.
super frustrating because I think there's more to this, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Justice?
Totally. I'm gonna get, how you get on that list and no one asks you to get on committees? I gotta maybe get the guy for that. There's some, a bunch of stuff that Brenda just brought up. It's interesting because there's duality to this as in anything. I think that we have to be open to the idea that maybe it's not broken. Maybe it works just like it was designed to work, and that's the problem. So maybe our task here is to break it. I get the idea that committees work, but I could name a number of instances where they have, and I would say neighborhood associations, where there's a number of instances, where they have been used deliberately to keep neighborhoods segregated, and they have not been very friendly or welcome to issues that have been specifically pertain to folks of color. But that ain't even what I was. All right, so all I was going to say is that I hope that we're able to understand that no matter who we talk to and how we're never going to, there's a concept, it's a Lonnie Sandercock concept, but making the invisible visible. Because there are a number of folks that it doesn't matter what we do, we're not going to reach everybody. That's the reality, and it doesn't mean that their views and their lived experiences are not valid. And we have to learn, I think, a type of language, a type of translational science, where when my people out here, selling dope, or doing whatever, they're talking to us. They're saying something about something that's happening isn't right. Now, they're not here at the committee signing up to speak, but it doesn't mean that their voice isn't real. And it doesn't mean that because we weren't able to get them in a room where they were able to give us a focus group and all these things, that what they're saying to us shouldn't count and shouldn't be in consideration. So I just want to say that, because the idea that we're going to employ a exhaustive process or a number of things, and then by that employment that we have somehow reached everyone or some representation. What about the people that are going to move here in 5 years? They don't get a voice. So we're going to make some structure. We're going to make some decisions here that they're going to be beholden to. They don't get a voice. They're not here yet, right? What about my people that are about to get out of that place? You know what I'm saying? Are ready to do some other work. They're not getting out though for 2 years. So do they get a voice? How do we include, again, the invisible? How do we make sure that we're making the invisible visible through every step of this process? I don't know that there's any way that we're going to reach everybody that's going to get here, and just to keep that in consideration.
Thank you.
Eric.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of that. And honestly, it's a perfect segue into what I'm about to talk about. I am one who is hopeful and childishly optimistic that we can build a process that has the potential to reach everybody. And maybe we don't actually reach everybody with that, but I think that it's possible. And I also think that in order to do that, we have to focus on ways of, to Justice's point, making the invisible visible, making the invisible heard. How do we prepare for folks who are not here yet or who don't know that they can participate, to some of the points that have been raised? So I'm going to offer an idea that has been tested and in a few different iterations. I'd invite you to, if you have one of these handouts, to just use the back, because I'm going to have you draw something so that we all have a visual. I just assumed I'd be able to press play on something here, but it's okay. It'll be interactive. So this is my community engagement activity for the task force here. Participation is key. All right, so at the top, in the upper left, I want you to write the letters COFC. C. And that stands for Council of Communities. And the idea is not a membership body or an organization with a 501c3, but the idea is that anyone participating in this process is essentially a type of council. Now, I'm not proposing that this replace the council. It's just an idea of a way to engage in a meaningful way and continuously. So a little bit under that, I want you to write letters next to each other. V, you can circle it. I, you circle that. And then O, you circle that.
And then what was the last one?
O, for Oscar. Sorry, I just had a stream of jokes run past my head. Okay. Okay, voicing, informing, and organizing are 3 tracks to what we would hope would be a complete process if it wasn't for the 3rd piece or 4th piece. And I want you to write the letter P somewhere else on your paper and circle that. And if you didn't use all caps, you did this wrong. I'm kidding. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm going to run through these tracks. We're going to draw some arrows, and then hopefully have some questions and come out of this with an idea of community engagement that might work for what we're trying to do with this task force, and also might work as a method that we employ continuously or continually. So Council of Communities, the goal here is to, with this process, is to elevate the voice, identify the most impacted, elevate that voice in a meaningful way, so going to that accountability, and then unite collaboration around that voice and the solutions that are there. Maybe that collaboration is found in the committees, maybe it's found in community organizations and leaders, but collaboration around a voice that we can hear clearly. So voicing is where we're getting the voice of the community. So we heard the idea of surveys and focus groups and community meetings, etc. Voicing this, and with the voicing track, the idea is to employ as many methods to bring the decision-making table to the community that's quote unquote we're trying to engage. So with that, we're talking about your standard community conversations, your focus groups, etc., but also telephone surveys. Can we call people up? When we were doing street activism with YGB, we went and knocked on people's doors. You got people knocking on your doors to elect somebody, to campaign. What if we campaigned to bring the voice, to bring that decision-making table back to the community? Can't tell you how many times I wish somebody would knock on my door and ask me specifically what we're going to do about this specific issue and be willing to put some work into that, as opposed to electing somebody that may or may not know my lived experience and may or may not be able to actually deliver on the needs that they feel the same way as I do about. So voicing brings the decision-making table to the community, to the most impacted, using a number of different mediums, including your door knocking, telephone surveys, and also a tool that allows for text participation in addition to your online. So if somebody doesn't have internet but they have a mobile phone, maybe they can text in their response. So employing all of the mediums. And I feel like it might be, if I asked anybody in this room what you thought would happen if you added another medium of communication to the number of responses that you got, I think most people would say we might get more responses. So maybe not everybody, but potentially more. Bringing the decision-making table to the community. And what we're asking is some variation of the question, what is it that you need? And what do you want to see change? So under that V, I want you to write, however you might remember that. What do you need? What do you want to see change? A couple question marks, needs, solutions, however you visualize that. Second track is informing. Informing is the same way as voicing, except here we're asking for information that supports what's been voiced. So using the same types of mediums, asking for something that will inform other people who don't know about this issue about that issue. So an example might be if we need, if an issue is, I need public transportation to my house in Owl Creek, a piece of information that supports that might be how long it takes to bike, or how long it takes to Uber, or how much it costs, or potentially what time I'm getting to and I'm having to come and go from my home. Or it could be a meme or a video or a documentary or some other report that shows that transportation in and out of a neighborhood is important. With these first 2 tracks, you have a place for anyone, including elected officials, to come and see what the needs are and potential solutions are in the community, and also to become informed about those issues. And maybe they don't share the lived experience, but perhaps they know a little bit more about it. The 3rd track is organizing. Before we go to the 3rd track, I want you to put your artsy hat on and draw an arrow from V to I and an arrow from I to O. Organizing is where we invite the community at large to give emphasis, agreement, disagreement on the first 2 tracks. So we understand that people want to be heard. People want to be heard, even if it's not something that is directly impacting them or related to them. Some people just want you to know their opinion about it. And if they have an avenue for that, perhaps they'll be supportive of a mechanism that empowers someone who is largely disenfranchised and doesn't get that opportunity to share their voice. Organizing is where we invite the whole community of people who are willing to participate to weigh in on what's been voiced and informed. And raising that emphasis or that agreement or disagreement, they can say, Owl Creek doesn't need a bus route. Or actually, I think Owl Creek does need a bus route. But we want to listen more closely to those that are most impacted. So I want you to draw a little star by O and write the word impacted. The most impacted people who are coming to and from the Owl Creek neighborhood should have a greater say-so as to whether or not Owl Creek has transportation than somebody who decided they were going to make it to the meeting so that they could just share their opinion. We want to hear from those that are most impacted. Now, this could apply to any number of issues. It could apply to, issues of childcare, healthcare, police brutality, public policy, etc. It could apply to anyone, any issue. The magic element is finding a way to identify who is most impacted. When you identify the most impacted, we can weight that weighing in, that agreement or disagreement, toward those that are most impacted in that issue. And with that, you start to see a distilled list of priorities. So I want you to draw a few lines, straight lines under your O. It's our list of priorities that are coming out of this feedback loop that we're creating. So on that list, you might see public transportation for Owl Creek. You might see transportation. You might see, what was another issue? Food access in the Allied Drive community. You might see the issue of cops in schools, police in schools. And what we want to do is, you might also see some of the racial disparities, the arrest rate, etc. And what we want to do is have a transparent way to see the priorities of the community as it relates to those that are most impacted. With these first 3 tracks that we're looking at right here, we have a way to see in a documented way, transparent way, the priorities of the community and understand the most impacted, their priorities as it relates to those issues. So we got this P sitting down here. P stands for priorities, P stands for plans. So what we want to do after these first 3 tracks is invite the community to self-select into issue committees that create a plan to address that priority or to make that solution a real thing. So I want you to draw a line from your O to your P. All we need is another P. Somebody's gonna get that later. Anyways, so with this, the issue committees, we're talking about community leaders, talking about community-based organizations, talking about the city government committees coming together to say, hey, we might have something to say about this food access issue or this transportation issue. We might have something to say about this mass incarceration issue or the issue of this new jail that's being built now. And that committee formulates a plan to address that issue. It's great. Wonderful plan, well-informed, and hopefully we have people that are most impacted also formulating that plan. But let's just say we don't. Let's just say we don't have anybody that is experiencing the issue playing a role in the solution to that problem. Well, the good part about that is I want you to draw an arrow from the P back to the V. The goal is to take that plan and run it through this same three-track process with respect to those that are most impacted, focusing on the most impacted, bringing that input to them and saying, hey, or bringing the opportunity to input to them and saying, what do you need? What do you want to see change as it relates to this plan? Should we scrap it? Are we missing something? We had folks from transportation, we had folks from the neighborhood, we had folks from other communities weighing in on this plan. Hopefully we took a good shot at it, but now, what do you need to see change with this plan? And with that, once we go through that voicing, informing, and organizing process with the plan, I want you to draw another arrow from the O, maybe up, and write the word implement, or you can do a IM or whatever. Sometimes I misspell implement, so I'm gonna just do IMPL. I know what I mean. And from there, we have a plan that we can implement that has the blessing of the community. It has collaborative participation from the community, whether that's government committees, organizations, and community leaders. And it's led and well-informed in a documented way by the most impacted. That plan, the plan that goes through this process, is a plan that's likely to actually succeed at its goal, no matter what that is. So, could this be something that, the other thing that I realized was that one of the issues with accountability is that, yes, we're gonna take in feedback and input, speaking generally, speaking of the status quo here, we're gonna take in feedback and input and really, really care about it, but not actually be able to do anything about it because for whatever reason with the city or with resources, here we're inviting collaboration of folks that may or may not have the resources to do that. Perhaps the community can do something that the city is not able to do right away. And this is what we ran up against in the Imagine Madison planning process. Folks were saying, what if we come up with something that y'all don't have the time to do? And the answer was, hopefully community can organize and get that thing done themselves. This is a way to not only empower in a transparent way decision makers to see clearly what the needs are and potential solutions are, but it's also a way to empower community to be that solution as well. So the question that I have is, wondering what your feedback is on this process, and I'll tell you where it's at in terms of its testing and the pilots that we've run. But aside from that, is this something that we use to engage the public as to how the local government should change? Or is this something that we place into local government to be a vehicle for continued community participation no matter what we're trying to change? Because it sounds like no matter what we're going to do, we want to engage the public in a meaningful way. Whatever we do, if we want it to work, perhaps that should be the thing that we make a standing thing in local government. Okay, I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Tori.
So, Eric, I just have a question. Have you ever used the racial equity analysis tools?
I've read through it and we've considered some of the concepts, but haven't actually gone through the full process.
So your process sounds very much like a racial equity analysis. And we've used them well over 100 times on many processes, both large and small processes. And it's a collaboration process. And one of the requirements of the analysis includes public participation and community engagement, which it requires us to have people from the community engaged in the process, community stakeholders, community associations, subject matter experts from the community. And so every time we enter into racial equity analysis, which is the lane, we lead with race in the city. We always bring community into the process. Those who are most affected by whatever decision, policy, process, regardless of what it is, we bring them into the process with us to inform us on what it is, the issue is, the crisis, the situation. That's part of the collaboration piece, because without it, we're just doing what government does best, which is to make decisions without the people who are most affected by the situation. That's what's different about a racial equity analysis. Part of what you've described is kind of similar to what we've been doing in the last 4 years with the analysis. We took this from another city, and over 200 municipalities is doing exactly that across the nation. I mean, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but that's what we've adopted in resolution in the city of Madison to be using as a tool that's working, and all 26 of our agencies are actually using it and required to do it as a practice. Justice?
So I think all these are really great, and they all probably have a place depending on what the question is that we're trying to ask, what it is and why we're asking it, and I think that stuff is as important as the vehicle through which we employ any type of public participation. The challenge I have both with community, I don't see it as a noun, I see it as a verb, and I'll always say that it's problematic when we assume that it's a noun and a static thing because it changes. A challenge we have in Madison that's very real is that we have a structural destabilizer through the way that we are employing our housing policies. And so you're seeing inordinate turnover in a lot of our neighborhoods, and it's not like subtle, it's like you move from Meadowwood to Sun Prairie. And that's happening yearly. And so right now I'm almost done with it, but we have a 5-year analysis of what happened in the Meadowwood neighborhood. And it's not just unique to there. It's happened all over Madison. And for the last 4 years, until last year, there was upwards of 55% turnover in that neighborhood. So in essence, when you start following where they're going, you'd say that if I was in Sun Prairie 4 years ago, I should have been in Meadowwood doing this thing, because by some random way, that's where you're going to be when they turn over. Another thing is that I think one of the challenges since time immemorial, and political philosophers will hate that concept, so I apologize if there's any of you in the room, but who gets to determine, the composition of this idea of community, so who gets to determine that? Because I think that will be contested space. I think the idea of impact, and when any issue is going to have an impact on a group of folks, that's going to be another contested space. Because people are going to say, how do you get to determine who's going to be most affected by whatever policy? And who gets to determine that? And under what? Because I could say and there's all this stuff, Owl Creek in particular, that was a failed development that was sold to the city of Madison. I presented that case to some folks from HUD. I don't think that's happened since the turn of the century. And that's my ICE example I always use, where you punch somebody in the eye and you come back later trying to sell them some ice. And so it's like, no, the issue is not that there's no bus route. It's the fact that we put some folks who are already dealing with some of the darkest dimensions of the human experience in the middle of an isolated area in the middle of nowhere. And so we're over here like, oh yeah, but what they need is a bus route. That's crazy. That's just crazy. Anyway, so I apologize for getting fired up, but I think that all these, at the end of the day, so I had to throw those things in there. Because this has been the challenge of governance forever. Since forever, is who gets to make these decisions? Who gets to determine, what I would ask us to consider, and it's just a challenge that I have, because it could totally be on me, but I always have a challenge figuring out how we're determining these things. But what I would ask us to think about is how do we think through how flexible these things will be to adjust later on, because we're
Exactly.
probably wrong. The information we have, and we're all very intelligent folks, but, you know, we don't know what we don't know. And in a couple of years, we're gonna find out that we were extraordinarily ignorant to a lot of things. So the question is, how do we make sure that whatever we do here, we're not beholden to decisions that we're making with inadequate and incomplete information? And I think that what Eric just put out, I think that this stuff is critical, and I think we should really think and consider all these issues that we brought, all these tools, so that when we're going out here, we don't think that there's just one way. I think that was a beautifully illustrated, I don't know if I got the structure right. I think I drew a dolphin. No.
That's right,
You know,
that's right, you got it.
but we should consider all these things, and we should make sure that we're being deliberate so that we're not bottlenecked or pigeonholed into one path moving forward.
Can I respond to this just a little bit? And to that point, the idea of flexibility, I think, is paramount, and it's the soul of this kind of model, where we're basically engaging in a documented and accountable way to build a system for accountability. And so I'll talk a little bit about one of the pilots that we're running. It's with the Madison Community Co-op, and they've got a small constituency, like a small community of 200 members. They've got about 12 properties throughout the city, and they're wanting to implement this model to change the way that their co-op structures, the way that their co-op is governed. And they're realizing that they have members that are disenfranchised, that they haven't heard from, that have needs that are specific to them. And because of they're not able to address them, they have issues. So in implementing this model, the first thing that we realized we needed to do was to figure out how we figure out who is the most impacted. How do we answer that question of impact? Can't just say, roll a dice and like, I'm most impacted. Because when it comes time to make a decision based on impact, and that decision is different from a majority of folks who want a different thing than who we're saying is most impacted, we're gonna be leaning on how we decided who was most impacted. So what we did was used this process to come up with elements that we rank in order to decide impact. And they were functions of your emotional and physical proximity to the issue, your personal experience with the issue, the level that it would impact your livelihood or your well-being, your level of safety as it relates to the issue, whether or not you were someone who was actually working in this thing or someone who was just kind of close to it because your cousin Nook Nook and them really liked it or whatever. Like, how impacted are you? And then, now we're not talking about an issue at this point. We're just talking about how we decide who's most impacted. And that was something that the majority of folks could agree on, because they all wanted to make sure that the thing that mattered to them was being considered when we're talking about impact. Everybody wants to have a voice. So now that we understand how we derive most impacted, how we get to that place of most impacted, it's not a decision that a person is making. They're saying, based on some statistics from 12 years ago in some other state, I'm most impacted. We're saying, based on the decisions that we made as a community and the things that we decided to look at when we're deciding who's most impacted, I'm actually most impacted in this situation. And that's not something that can be argued at the point where we're talking about impact. So it makes decisions easier later because we all agreed that and I'm not saying that it would be perfect, but it's also something that can be, that can change as time goes on. And it's not, a statute that is based on archaic and, black and white rules. Okay. So thanks for that, Justice. Are there any other questions on this Council of Communities collaborative way to direct democracy?
I have an observation and a question. And just as I was doing my drawing, mine looks like kind of a lopsided heart with the thing sticking out of it. Like maybe a Cupid arrow or something, I don't know. But there's like a double loop. And it kind of aligned with what, Karl started out with talking about, at the bottom of this page, about a two-phase process of public participation and needing different methods for each phase. And so I like this kind of going back over and checking, because I think that's what we were contemplating having to do anyway. And my other question is like just a practical question: who administers and organizes all this? Yeah.
So, very good question. Right now, it's the leader of the organization that is hosting the pilot. And they are responsible for designating volunteers or staff to steward the processes. And then when it comes to the actual public engagement of calling people up, that's a volunteer thing. Or door knocking, that's a volunteer thing. At least what we've seen in the pilots. But the leader is the person who's requesting that the pilot be done for their organization. There's a full version of this that's sort of like in a dream world, where there's an engagement director and an implementation director. And those people, one person focuses on stewarding the engagement process and making sure that volunteers are doing the outreach, et cetera, making sure that folks who are meeting in groups and have the capacity to do that they have what they need. And then the implementation director is someone who's working with those issue committees to make sure that they're connecting to the resources that they need to get to steward their plans to success. So that's something that later on in the future we'll begin to see when we come across a pilot that has the resources to do that. But for now, it's just the staff of the organization or an army of volunteers.
I just want to do a check here on time and what we also need to talk about tonight. It seems to me that the topic of public engagement is both a really important process topic for our work. How do we use best tools, good tools, to engage the public in the work of examining the structure of, not just the structure of Madison government, but the question, I think, how do we govern ourselves, is a more accessible question, and it really matters more to me. And since we've suspended the rules, I get to talk. So be careful. But I think that so how we engage our fellow residents in our process of examining governance in the city of Madison and structures is one part of the public engagement topic. But another part of the public engagement topic is the one that Brenda referred to and that we all lit up on the other night, and that is that public engagement is part of governance. And is that part of our governance working well? And I think that these two topics and the work that we do ought to inform, the first part of the work ought to inform the second part of our work. And it is probably, I want to check with the task force members here, I think it is our first topic. That we at least do some kind of a dive on public engagement and think and make some decisions about how we plan to engage the public in our work before we move on to substantive topics. Do we agree on that? I'm looking around, seeing heads nodding.
No, I don't know.
Okay, you don't? Okay,
No.
go ahead.
I think that why we're engaging and what we're engaging them for and all these things are as important as the vehicle through which we engage them. And I think if we don't, I feel like we can hamstring ourselves by saying this is the way to do it and then going out there and then starting to ask those other questions, because it might be the case that we'll find out through that process that we're going to come up with some things that maybe that isn't the way to do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it is or isn't, but I think it's something that we should leave open so that, and I think we've gotten some examples of a lot of ways to do this. And I think we should keep building on that. And I think as we're going forward, I think it's important that we're thinking deliberately and I always, this is a methodology is only as good as its transparency into its limitations, and that's it. And so so it's saying when we go out there and we do our public participation process that it's not, who is it not going to reach? What are its limitations, and what are the things that we are not going to be able to see through this process and then move and be fine with that? But I don't know that we start with a way that we're going to do public participation right now when we don't know what we're participating in.
I hear you, and I also think, I'm trying to think about how we can organize ourselves to do our work. I hear what you're saying, and I agree. And I also think that, that we need some subset of us to come back with an idea that we perhaps begin by asking one or two questions or three questions. What are those questions that would help us begin our work in considering the way that we govern ourselves in Madison, structurally and otherwise, and whether or not, that help us consider that and do a good job of engaging all of the people, or trying to engage all of the people in the community who we really need to engage in that. So I think that we have a process question. How do we begin? How do we begin our public engagement? And what are we engaging on, for starters? Would that?
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think about this just in terms of methodology, and I think the trick to methodology is that you always state your limitations. And I think a challenge I've had, again, this is a challenge I've had with a lot of whether it's any of these processes, is that they assume that they say, well, this is what we engage in public. And they don't talk about the limitations and who they didn't engage and the challenges with that. So they assume, and so they make a point of saying all the things that they did to engage, instead of saying, well, look, we had to pick a path. This is the path we picked. These are the limitations, and this is where we got to come back and address it later, because we're not going to find a perfect public, a thing that's going to engage everybody.
But we can't evaluate that until we've done something.
Oh, yeah, fair. I don't think it stops us from, as a matter of fact, I think it helps us.
Okay.
I think the two
Sherry?
of you are saying the same thing, or that's what I'm hearing. You kind of, yeah, I think you are.
Well, I think, I understand what you're saying, and I don't disagree. I'm also thinking, how do we structure our work to move us along? Sherry?
Well, I was just gonna say that I think that we have to be flexible in the sense of, as we go out and do public engagement, come back and analyze if it was effective, what can we change about it, how can we address some of the things that maybe we felt we didn't address when we did it. But I think we have to do the first one, or at least talk about how we're going to do the first one, I should say, and then really analyze it to make sure that we are delivering the right message when we go out. But we always have to come back and analyze what we did in order not to wait until the end, because I think that would really be detrimental if we did that.
Rebecca?
So the two things you just said, how are we going to engage people, what are we engaging on? I think we need to get really clear on what we're engaging on first.
Yeah.
And that might suggest certain methods. And I feel like we need to come up with how to ask that question, how do we want to be governed, in a variety of ways, and then figure out how to do that. I also don't want to lose this piece that Brenda and multiple people, Justice brought up in another, just talking about the power, the context of power in the city, and whether it be real estate development and housing patterns, or who's in office at a given moment and what that administration looks like, and how things are influenced, and kind of be clear about how we're asking this question might be impacted or have an impact on those things. So I feel like that's really important for us to collectively get clear about, yeah.
John?
I mean, one of the things that, I think I mentioned this at the first meeting, is that I'm concerned about the breadth of what we're supposed to look at, and yet I don't know, like Brenda said, well, what's broken? What isn't working now? And then we can have some focus on how we can do that. And I think we can do that through various forms of engagement. We just don't know what they are yet. But, and it's suggested in the resolution, talk to people who have served in government, whether it's as a mayor or as a council member, talk to city staff, let them talk, members of the public, developers, anybody who's willing to come in and tell us what isn't working. What are the things that they really feel don't work, so we can identify those things and then figure out how do we engage people in reaching those problems, studying those problems. And we have a whole lot of different forms of ways we can do that. Are there too many people who have served on committees? People who wanted to serve on committees but weren't selected. I mean, all those people are ones I'd like to hear from.
Does anyone, just before we go back around, anyone who we haven't heard from? Paul, do you want to say anything on any of this? Okay. Sarah, and then we'll come back.
But I was going to say kind of a similar, so John started to ask what could be an initial question, right, which is like what's not working. I was going to suggest an initial set of questions as well, which was maybe a little bit more to, Eric, you made the point of like how do you determine who's most impacted, and you basically defined a set of like criteria that were high level enough that they were transparent. I was thinking in some processes like this, you would start from a values place, right? You'd start with when you're asking how do you want to be governed, you'd start with what are the underlying values around governance, and that would give us a sense, and that's something that might be more real for people or not, right? I don't know, but I just wanted to suggest there seems to be a values conversation around government that we could have and ask, but I think we have to define a first set of questions, a process to go through those questions, knowing the limitations of those processes, and to Sherry's point then kind of iterate on that, but at least define our first.
Right. What are we asking? What's the process? Eric?
Yes, thank you, and I appreciate what's been said as well. It sounds like, so the way that I see this is that we are tasked with engaging the community to gather information that will lead to recommendations that we hope will be implemented in a real way. So if our task is to engage the community, and we want to make sure we're doing that in the best way possible, we have models and ideas for how to start, but perhaps something that might make our job easier is to choose a method or series of methods to talk to communities about the best ways for them to engage in this process. And perhaps that will shed light on what we do next in terms of, okay, I'd rather we learn about government and then do something, or maybe we might hear, actually, you can come to this shop, there's gonna be a party, have a survey or something like that, and it will give us opportunities to reach the people that we're hoping to reach. And in those settings, potentially receive recommendations based on the sort of, I guess, instructions that we get from the question of how should we go about this community engagement.
Justice?
I'm going back to the charter, one thing, for a brief time that I was working on this project with the mayor's office, one thing that I always felt really frustrated by was that people came in there and, we work under a system of federalism, whether we like it or not. And there's certain things that municipalities do, and there's certain things that county governments do, there's certain things that states do, there's certain things that federal government do. And people would come in there and I would feel really bad because they would spend their hour or whatever talking about things that actually were not under the purview of municipal government. And I felt horrible for them because they were in there talking to him, you know, like he was Oz, and he acted like, but it wasn't, you know, in terms of what they could have been doing, you know. So I go back to being very disciplined about what the task is for this committee or for this task force, or, you know, what is the difference between a task force and a committee? I feel like task force is
Well,
like
statutorily, it is.
Anyway, for this cabal. Anyway, I feel like that's, you know, so I feel like making sure that we're staying disciplined to that, because, and that was a challenge that I had with Imagine Madison. Again, challenge I had was that I felt like the question in terms of what a planning department and why you have a comprehensive plan, that is set out in statute. And so when you had a lot of folks coming together and they start talking about everything in the kitchen sink, I mean, it's good to hear. And I think as a guilty of being a planner, but it's good for us to hear all these things. However, the nature of a lot of service delivery that's dictated and governed by the county, I don't know what Imagine the folks at the planning department in the city of Madison are going to do with that information other than like write it down. I don't know what they did with it. But these are things that I think we should be very disciplined about, because, and it has as much to do with our integrity when we go out and talk to folks. And we say, well, how do you, because we cannot become a monarchy, because this ain't no country of Madison. You know what I'm saying? Like, we are a city within a state, you know, that we have to be conscious of this. Because if we go out there and say, well, how do you, and then we start hearing all this stuff, we run into this integrity thing, because they're going to come out, all right, cool. So they're going to come out like, Justice, I got 6 people that still like me in the world, so they'll come out, my 6 people, and they'll talk to me, and we'll go. And then I'll come back, and then they'll wait, and then this task force will conclude, and they'll be like, yo, man, it's still the way it was. So you must have just taken what I said and just thrown it out. And I want to, you know, so us to be careful of our integrity as we go out and work with people who we love and care about in these places. Again, I say neighborhoods, I see community fundamentally as a verb and not a noun. So I'm always going to, that'll just insert that every time we say community. Know that I'm over here disagreeing. Anyway, yeah, right. So I just want us to be careful with that. So as we go out and we do this, let's just be really conscious of what this task force is charged with, so that we're not out here wasting everybody's time, so we start getting a bunch of stuff that we actually don't have any purview over.
Okay, I'm going to hear from Karl and then bring it back to next steps.
Yeah, it just strikes me that, you know, you've kind of been talking about, I think, potentially 2 things that the task force could look at. One is, you know, what's working now or what's not working now, and I think Tarek had mentioned, and I think Jewel as well, that, you know, the Imagine Madison process, for example, one of the elements of that is effective governance, right? And then we've also had an internal team of people looking, as part of our performance excellence review, for example, looking at effective governance. And they've got some information there, at least that would be a topical thing to talk about. And again, I think you also informing that conversation when people would talk about here's what we've heard, for example, on the community, I think from the comprehensive plan side, but also this internal team has been looking at this idea of effective governance, how do we do better? You know, again, you could potentially get that, and then also start, I think, you know, Justice's point too, that sometimes jurisdictions get confused, and, you know, other kinds of things happen that, you know, what are those things that are challenges for people? You know, how do we get access to services, other things that, you know, we know, sort of start creating that list. And then maybe the second point, to go along with Eric's point about that idea of, you know, is there a way that we could start talking to some, you know, to communities, right? Is there a way that we could start talking to some groups and sort of start to hear, you know, what they have to say as a way to, again, to start informing, all right, how does this lead then to the diverse approach that we might take, multiple approaches we might take to kind of continuing to get input along the way. But, you know, kind of, all right, let's, you know, what are some challenges that we're seeing, and then what are some things that people in the community might see as challenges, you know, and then keep bringing that back here to kind of, then, again, to go back to asking that big question, and then what's that sort of methodology that we could go forward with, or what are the techniques we can employ to really continue to gather more and more input to come up with recommendations.
It seems that if we start with a few questions, and questions that I'm hearing around the table are, how do we want to be governed, what's working, what's not? that if we start with those questions and use some different techniques to engage with parts of the community around those questions and test that out, we may learn whether those are useful questions and whether the techniques that we use with the particular stakeholders and community members are effective. We may also learn that some people in the community don't care about those questions. We may learn a lot. But, you know, I'm wondering if that might be a starting point. If there is a subgroup of the task force that would be, this is where we get to the question of forming subcommittees and working groups, because I think that we're not going to be able to meet our charge if we don't form some working groups. So what would you think about coming out of tonight's meeting with a small working group that will identify some elements of the community, that will consider the input that we have from Eric, from the team from the city, from your own minds about how to engage, and just come up with an engagement. Terry?
So I'm speaking for myself and all my expertise around this kind of stuff. And I guess I go back to, I think, the vehemence with which Justice first expressed, like, yeah, I don't know if I agree. I think public participation, community engagement in general can be very seductive because we want to find out what everybody thinks and we want to be inclusive, and that's really, really important. But I would just, you know, the expression, you go slow to go fast. And I know that this task force is getting going. It sounds like there's still, you know, there's questions that I've heard a few times around this table. So what is it that we're doing here? You know, that's how I've interpreted some of the questions. You know, what is the question that we're trying to answer? And it's dangerous to go out into the community to ask people what they think about something if someone's not ready to really explain what that something is even. You know, it can be a trap. And so I know that part of this is the public participation process. I know when I was invited into this presentation, the first thing I talked to Mike and I talked to Tori and I said, wait, already? Do they know what they're really grappling with yet? Because I think that's very important. And so with all respect, I just really encourage the group to take some time as a body to figure out and really get grounded in this is what we're doing, this is what the charge is. And so I hear the idea of pulling together and saying what are the questions we want to engage the community around, but I think that even before that, it's what are the questions that we're really trying to answer? You know, and that might shift, going back to that flexibility. But until like everybody's really on board with that same set of questions, this is what we are now doing going forward, I think it can get very muddled. And there's potential to lose people early if there's not that clarity from the get-go. Thanks.
John?
I just, a follow-up question I'd like to ask for you then. So the charge that we got requires us to talk to former mayors, current council members, all of these things. In your opinion, when do we start doing that process?
I guess if you guys
we heard from Brenda tonight, so we got one input.
Sure,
But
no.
that's it.
If you all are already at that point where, within the charge, there's reviewing you've gathered the information you feel like you might need to have. You've looked at other ways in which some of these questions have already been asked and answered by the community, so you have an informed base that you're starting from. If you've kind of defined what's in bounds, what's out of bounds, and you're clear on that, and what the limitations of even the power and ability to change things might actually be, once you have those pieces, that's when I think you start going more broad. I think there are ways with smaller and more discrete folks, maybe this gets back to pointing the chair, where you're having conversations with city staff or former committee members, some of that can happen a little bit earlier, and I think maybe that goes back to the original suggestion. But taking it out broadly, that's once I think you've got, frankly, a little bit more clarity. So to me, it's taking those initial steps to really pull in the information. Do you know what you know? Do you know what you don't know?
Maggie?
Yeah, thank you. So that was very well said, and that's what I need. I need a little bit of clarity because I'm very confused. All I hear is us going around in circles and talking about the chicken and the egg, and which one comes first. Do we have the problem and take it out of to the community and try to solve it together? Or do we go out to the community and ask them what the problem is? So I think I've been really, and we've heard some amazing arguments tonight and considerations, and it'll be a very difficult task, or particularly for myself. And I honestly don't know where I stand on this, so I'm looking forward to your guidance.
I would suggest a couple of things. One, we need to keep going back to the resolution from the council. That's our charter. And as I read that, there are two tasks. One is a public engagement task. And what I'm not clear on, and I've read the legislative history and I'm still not clear on it, is the extent to which public participation and engagement is not only something that the council wanted this group to do in assessing the structure of city government, but also did the council want us to look at public engagement as one of the aspects of city government? And I can't tell when I read the resolution. So that is, we would look at the executive and the legislative body and the boards, commissions, and committees, and also public engagement is that, and make recommendations about that. I can't tell that myself from reading the resolution. And so when I read it, I'm inclined to think, yes, they wanted that too. Rebecca?
Well, luckily, you have the authors of the second and
Yes.
third substitute amendments who can speak directly to that at the table. And as the author of the third and final one that we have in front of us, no, that was not.
Okay, that makes it easier.
It's not in there. That wasn't part of yours. That wasn't part of the mayor's. Although in the mayor's, I'm not going to speak for the mayor. But as far as public engagement, I mean, that's why the committees, boards, and commissions were added. And the powers and responsibilities of those were added to get at how does that public voice enter into the public decision-making process. So as to Maggie, the chicken and the egg thing, nobody from the public came to the council and said, we think the way that government is structured is a problem. Zero. It was all these internal little conversations, debates, power struggles between council members and the mayor's office or amongst council members. This is where this problem, quote unquote, originated. So I think it might be good to hear from folks on all sides of those debates, since that's where, that's where this whole thing came from. That's where it started, and it has some deep roots, going back years. That might be helpful to hear about those debates.
So would those be listening sessions, do you think? We would invite different parties, sort of like the list that John provided,
Yeah.
some of what Brenda mentioned, that we would, that would be the starting point? So we're not.
I think that would help, but like for those of us, I mean, Sarah and Paul and Sherry and I are in kind of a different position where we've heard that, I mean, we've been in this, we've heard these things before, and y'all haven't. And there's a reason why there's more of you guys than us here. So I think that might be a good idea to invite and see. I don't know if it shouldn't just be a one-time thing either. Right. Because we do want to hear from all sides of the debate, right?
And also acknowledging, again, methodologies are as good as its limitations, but acknowledging that our alders are a form of public participation. at the end of the day, right? That they are a form of public participation. Now, again, in terms of limitations, we can all fill in, but they are.
And the question for them is, what's the problem? And we might hear there is no problem, it's just the way it's done, or there's a huge problem. You know, that's a simple question.
Did I hear, so you mentioned something about one of the aims being answering the question of how public participation enters into local government decision-making. Did I hear that as part of what you were? As part of what we're supposed to be doing?
Eileen asked, was that part of the directive? Is that an explicit part of the directive? And it's not. It's not. But the addition, so on the third iteration, we added and like expanded a bit the boards, commissions, and committees to, as a way to get at that.
So it is.
Do you see what I'm? So it's part of it, but it's not like opening it up. It's really about that question, what are the powers that you kind of brought up? How does a resident's participation in this make any sense or feel worthwhile, right? How, what are those powers? Could they be expanded, what's the point of them if people are feeling like they're meaningless, or if some might be too powerful, right?
I'm glad you said that. The way the conversation was going, I was beginning to think that was something that we should not focus on, but hearing this additional clarity, it sounds like that we were kind of still, at least my understanding of what we're here to do was accurate, and that we are addressing, so it's not explicitly stated, figure out how the public has input and say in this, but we're still addressing power structures.
Yes.
And a way to address that might be improving the way that the public can engage and participate.
Got it, yeah. Sarah?
The only thing I would add, and I agree completely with everything Rebecca just said, I think we called out these three kind of formal structures because they are the formal governance structures that we have right now of the Common Council, the mayor, and boards, commissions, and committees. So it makes sense when you're talking about governance to speak to the formal structures of governance that we have right now.
Yeah.
I would like to add.
Sure.
Brenda brought up a very important point. How do people get appointed? I like to reiterate that. Who is the appointing authority? What is the diversity of the committees? Who gets to make votes on issues when the community brings issues to certain committees? And why do the community get to bring certain issues to certain committees that have an impact on certain other communities? All kinds of different things, and you haven't gotten there yet. You haven't gotten there yet. And I think to your point, Rebecca, is those are the types of things that kind of keep the mayor and the council splitting hairs, right? And the committees, the boards, and the commissions. That's kind of why you're here. What is that power? Because the diversity is lacking, right? There's not a fair representation across our community and our boards, committees, and commissions. Now, that goes back to public participation. People have to want to be civically engaged and want to show up to participate. But then there's also the who gets appointed when they try to put their hands in the pool. They need to get appointed then. So who has the ability to appoint, to sit on those boards, committees, and commission? And then to your point, Eric, when you talk about impacted, who gets to make the decision of who's closest to the issue of impact? Right?
I have
Go ahead.
Okay, so I like the idea, just to get to a concrete, and thank you for that, Tori. It sounds like figuring out who we need to talk to is what is coming up for me. And given that this was something that was brought up by the council and some of the folks that are still very close to this process, I like the idea of having a session where we sort of do some investigation as to where folks are at with the issues that they've been experiencing. And maybe that looks like some iteration of these tracks, or maybe it's this and the other models that we've seen inform that process. But I think it would make sense for us to, and I'd like to land on a decision, if are we going to, or can we have a session or more where we talk about issues, talk to these bodies, these governing bodies, about the issues that they've experienced, and start our conversation and our learning there as well.
So John was suggesting, I think, that we invite perhaps people who have held positions in the past, in the recent past, to flesh out your idea, John.
People who
Or-
hold them now.
Okay,
I mean, that's where it all started.
That's in the resolution.
Okay.
So I'd listen to
It's a
those,
big
but
list.
I
There are a
think
lot of people.
I believe that those relationships change with personalities. So looking at the past and their perspective is an important part of this process, but we certainly ought to hear from the people who are serving now at some point, and I would say sooner is better than later as far as I'm concerned. I want to know what was on their mind when they voted for this task force. You know, what did they really expect of us? What
What
is,
write a survey about? Because those are people who will fill in surveys.
I'd like the chance,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I'd like any of us to have the chance to ask questions of those people as they speak
But if,
as
I mean,
well.
this is, as Eileen pointed out, that's a lot of people.
Right.
It's a broad thing, so.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one level of engaging them, and then another is the highly motivated ones can come and really.
But we
Would
don't
there
have
be any,
subpoena powers, so I
Right.
don't think we can get anybody who doesn't want to.
No,
Mike,
sorry. I know.
are there any meeting issues with, let's just say, that we divide it up and in pairs as members of the task force, and through a combination of survey and interview, gathered information and threw it into some kind of database for ourselves, and then had some follow-up at an actual meeting with some few of these people. I mean, there are many former alders. There are a lot of living former mayors. There are probably a zillion people who've been on boards and commissions. And, you know, we have a hard time coming up with meeting times, and our time is precious. So how are we going to collect that information? Mike? Justice?
I'll have some.
Yes, go ahead. Well, okay, look it. No, does anyone realize how peculiar it is for a city like Madison to not have contested elections, and how weird that is, and what that? I mean, there's a number of things that are speaking to us again, that I think, and I go back to the idea of appointments in committees and such. When you have, and I could make this case later, different therapy session, but when you have an entire segment, when you have segments of a population that have been systematically, we'll say, suspended or ostracized from democratic processes and institutions, I would say one of the things that the manifestations of that are uncontested elections. And so I say all that to say that some of these things we don't need to do a whole lot of examination on. It's right there in front of us. Non-contested elections in a city like Madison, I don't know that you will find that anywhere. Again, this is one of those Madison unique things. That is crazy. And we're seeing it in every function, every form of our government here. School boards, we got uncontested elections. Yet everybody will tell you, when you sit down with them, everybody will go through A, B, C, X, Y, and Z about the challenges that we have with our schools. Uncontested elections. Same thing with our alders. Uncontested elections. The same thing we're seeing with our counties. And so, like, these are things that I think we don't need a whole lot of examination. They're sitting in front of us, right? So like, right. And so just keeping that in mind, we ain't got to talk to nobody to see that. And anyway, I was just thinking about the comment that was made about the appointees and all, and like where that's coming from. Because the idea is that, you guys did I appreciate Mike and the team for putting that together, the presentation. I thought it was really well done. I mean, I get that it meant, there was probably a lot of stuff out there, but I think just outlining the way that's structured versus the way it's actually operating, I think I'm sure that there's a gap.
I'd like Alder Kemble to maybe give just a little more background on how we got to here with this resolution, and in particular, you put this together sort of as a reaction to another proposal that was out there.
So it was like an attempt at compromise.
Right, but no, I'd back up. It's not. It's before that. It was the proposal to remove the mayor's appointing authority and turn it over to the president of the Common Council, and that was what Alder Kemble told me. She said when she saw that, wait a minute, if we're going to go there, we need to step back and ask ourselves, how do we want to structure this government? Is that the one change we would make if we were going to make some changes? Anyway, you tell it.
Whatever you, 2016, was that 2016? 2016, two alders proposed 5 different, they were ordinance changes to change the structure of the Finance Committee and the powers of the President of the Council, and some major proposals to change government. And I strongly objected to them because I thought these were decisions that the people of the city should be making, not just us, about how we do our jobs. The mayor also thought that, and he promised at that time that he would put together this group. He didn't put it together. A year passed, and alders were pressuring him, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Finally, he put out the first version of putting this group together, which was much broader than what we have in front of us, and involved, I believe it was a committee of 15 residents and maybe 1 alder and 1 person from the mayor's office. No alders? I thought there was like one and 1 from, but it was resident heavy and very broad in scope. And then Alder Eskridge did another, a substitute, a version 2 that was much tighter, much smaller. Was it 4 alders and 3 subject matter experts? And it was just about the powers of the mayor and the powers of the council, and then there, arguments on either side of that. Was either of them going to get the votes? I found myself in a place where I couldn't have voted for either of them because I saw benefits to both of them, and there was no one. So that's when I came up with the resolution that is governing this group now with the support of Alder Eskridge and the mayor, and that's where we find ourselves now, because there were changes being proposed that I and others felt that the council shouldn't be making these kind of really important decisions on the structure of government without the consent of the governed. So this is basically, this is why public participation has come into it, and that was what Alder Eskridge put in hers. It was a smaller committee, but she added this, we have to have innovative ways of public participation. So this is kind of philosophically the waters we're swimming in, and and politically where some of these struggles were coming from.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, really quickly. I feel like this really brings it home for me in terms of our just context is really, really helpful. I do still think that there's strong value in talking to and getting some input as to what some of those issues that derive that need to make whatever changes. from the people that wanted to make them. And then, not that we're going to get into it in detail tonight, but it sounds like some amount, I mean, yes, what we're doing right now is a level of public engagement, and we got some education on the structure of government. We're going to hopefully get some education on what some of those issues were, and then do some work in terms of our own idea of what maybe, this is the way we go, recommendations would be, and use different models to distill and document that. But it also sounds like we should do some work in doing these same steps in different public settings. So I like the idea of figuring out what that engagement with the governing bodies looks like, whether it is a survey. And so I like the idea of having a small group that looks at, let's talk to the government folks, having a small group that looks at, let's talk to the community, and, you know, as a noun and a verb, and come back to this group with a plan to do that, and then we discuss those plans and make a decision and do it.
Yeah, if I might just ask a question. This was really helpful to me. Because I haven't been involved in these little squabbles between the city council and the mayor and all of it, you know. So getting as focused as we can on exactly what it is that we are supposed to be doing, as Justice is recommending, I think, and everyone else, is really key. And I'm wondering if our next step is to plan ways to get that information from people who have lived these experiences, and to just leave it at that for the next step. And see what we have, what we make of it, what we learn from it. And your point, very well taken, Tariq, about not going out until we know exactly what we're going out for and with, and I really appreciated that. So if our next step is just that, is to plan for our engagement with current and former people who have served in different roles in Madison's government, including board, commission, and committee people, as well as alders and mayors. And ask them, and if we task a small group to figure out what we want to ask them, but assume that some of what we want to ask them is what works and what doesn't. Justice?
Absolutely, and I just would just be conscious, I mean, we are in essence not really a decision-making body, correct? We have not been deputized to decide this, right? So that's important for us to know, and I'm speaking from a recent experience with another committee for the school district, that we are conscious of that as we go forward, because what we should be trying to figure out is from the people who will be making these decisions and who will eventually have to do something about this, what will help them the most? As long as you got us around here, and I feel comfortable with the experiences and everything that we bring when we got the rest of our whole team, the whole task force together with capes and all. No, but when we're all here, I'm gonna get us some capes. Is that enough about
I got some.
We
T-fog.
No, but you know that we come together, and because if we waste the time that we're gonna spend together, if we come out of here and we have not explored everything so that we can give the people who will make this decision a number of considerations, then I think we will we would have wasted our time. So just being really deliberate and getting that information from them as they come in here and explain what their challenges have been is all right, so cool. So what is it exactly that we could be doing here to help you get the information you need so that when you go out here and do it, you have been able to do that. And I think at that point, that's where we go back to some of this stuff that Aaron was talking about, and we start getting busy with it.
Okay, we're going to hear from Mike, and then we're going to get back. Then I would like to return to, what do we call it, ordinary business, or the rules, or the agenda, and not be in a state of suspension.
Well, let me just suggest, when we get to the meeting dates, that'll show you that based on what we got from people, we've got a little bit of time before you're all going to be getting back together again. and we have subcommittees on the agenda, I think when you get to subcommittees, it would be wise for you to propose maybe 3 people from this group who could meet with staff and work out this plan that you want to have in terms of taking surveys of former public officials, inviting them in for comment, however you want to do it, so that we have some input from the committee, and then the staff can help you do it. They could maybe even start to think about a survey, what questions might be in a survey, and bring that all back to this body to say, does this sound like a way to go for that first step of talking to public officials? If you do that, another issue that you may want to think about, and this came up because I met with somebody from IT today about starting to create a web page for this group. At some point, you're going to need a communications subcommittee, not to do the actual public engagement, but to work on what information are we pushing out on this web page that people see, because that's going to be important to make those decisions, and I'm not capable of figuring that out. So those, I think, are a couple of things you could do as we go forward to the rest of the agenda, including talking the next, I think, is the meetings. But.
Yes, we're on to item 7, future meetings. Late, like when I got here tonight, I saw that I had received from the staff in the city attorney's office the compilation of all of the information about when we are available, and the next good date appears to be April 30th. That is the date in April when more members than any other date can be available. So I would propose that April 30th be our next meeting date, and the time, I think, will be 6 p.m. Unless you receive notice otherwise, and we'll get back to you about location. Also, I've sent those dates to you, so you all have them. And what I would like to do is send out my sense of what May, June, and July, and August look like based on those data, so that we can reserve at least one night a month. When we are planning to meet, we can always cancel the meeting, but we have the information, and we might need to try to pick a second night sometimes. Is that okay, process-wise?
Yeah. Have we decided how often we'll be meeting, full council versus smaller groups?
My suggestion is that we agree that we will set one meeting night a month.
Okay.
For sure. And then as we are working, we've got some data about other possible nights that might work for people, but let's agree that one night a month we will hold. Is that agreeable? Okay.
And
good.
Just so people know, the next date is May 14th, after April 30th.
Yeah.
And that's the only day in May, really, where people...
April 30th, May 14th. And I was gonna send a list out to everybody after this meeting. There just wasn't time beforehand, so please watch your email for that.
Is it possible to get the invites sent out for that?
Not from me.
We can do that. You asked for actual Outlook invites, and we will do that, as opposed to just sending an email that says this is when the meeting is. I think some people respond to that. That was a good comment that I hadn't thought of.
Would it be agreeable if we just go ahead and pick the nights, looking at the data, and send the invites out, and no more discussion about this? Great. We'll do that. The next item on the agenda, subcommittees. We've already heard suggestions for 2 different subcommittees. One to plan our interview and questioning of former and current government officials, the other subcommittee for communications. Who would be willing to be on the subcommittee? Let's have 3 people on it to plan. John, I saw your hand go up. Sarah? Eric, excellent. So they are going to, no, they're planning how we are going to reach out and get information from current and former city officials, committee members. What is our plan for that? Who, how, when, and bring that back to our meeting on April 30th, please.
Can I suggest that that's maybe not an actual subcommittee, if they just have one job? Can we? Yeah.
An ad hoc.
But there might be useful to have like some kind of organizational subcommittee that might do things like that.
Well, yes. I think it would. And I would think really, what I think would be helpful would be to have something almost like a little executive committee to plan, to keep thinking about what next, what do we need to do, how do we need to structure meetings, how can we, without running afoul of open meetings laws, be feeding that out to members of the task force and engaging the whole task force, so that, sort of looking on the horizon, looking ahead, here's what we see, how does that look? That would be really helpful, and I would nominate myself to be on that, and would really like Eric? Justice, great. So that will be a standing subcommittee, the planning or executive, or, yeah, okay. So we have a little ad hoc work group that's going to do this plan for getting input from current and former officials. Then we've heard a recommendation, and this is really, this is work that our task force has to do. We need a communications subcommittee. And, I think that ideally, since I think we're going to be working for over a year to get this work done, I think I would like to ask that we have an agreement that everyone will take a turn on the communications subcommittee, and that we will have 3 people on it, and they will rotate on and off after a couple of months, and do a really good job of explaining to the next group what happened. Here's where we are, here's what we've done. So would that be agreeable, that we really all take some responsibility on this? Justice?
Yeah, I would just recommend that we, just thinking about QI, that we put in a time where we can revisit any of these committees,
Yes.
these subcommittees, so that it doesn't, it doesn't get sclerotic.
Yep. Well, we can always, we have on our agenda, if we put on all future agendas, assessment of organization and work, so that we can always bring that up.
Check-ins.
Or check-ins, yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Check-ins and assessment, yeah. Sarah?
That was maybe a suggestion. Just, it'd be great to get an update, especially from the executive group, what you're thinking moving forward. Just at each meeting, a little status update.
I wasn't taking minutes, and who is on the executive group?
You, Eric, and Justice.
I'd like to ask whether there isn't a quorum issue about adding John Rothschild to that group too, because John's the vice chair, and we're a little bit interchangeable. So I would.
Are you concerned that there won't be an older person?
No.
No. Okay. I'm not
No,
concerned,
'cause
but
I
if
think that-
any of you are.
I've been talking to Mike about how it is, about how I can possibly pick up the phone and call individual ones of you to talk about our work without running afoul of open meetings laws. And so this is an ongoing conversation that
Yes.
we're having. I just can't believe it myself, that this is not such an easy thing to do. But one idea that we had that I just wanted to throw out is that we could have a frequently scheduled meeting, which would be noticed, that would be lunch or coffee, or it could be a different, and whoever can show up, it's, there's not going to be any decision-making at this meeting, but it's an opportunity to sit and talk with each other. It'll be publicly noticed, so if the public wants to come for coffee too, they can come. But I find it really hard to work with a group of people when we can only talk to each other in this kind of setting.
The problem with that is if enough of us don't show up, we can't talk. If it's noticed, right?
You have to have a
Yeah.
quorum.
You have to have a quorum.
Only to talk about the meeting.
But if, we can't talk about anything?
Well, the appearance of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Let me think some more about how to do that,
Okay, well,
Eileen. I mean,
we're
I think it
looking-
may be better if you have sort of a rotating subcommittee of some sort like that also with an unspecified membership, but I'll have to think about how you can do that.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
I think it's a
would
great
do
idea, but
a fun
we're stuck by this rule in the city about 15 minutes to have a quorum.
I would really like to be able to talk to the members of the task force, just to say, how's it going, you know?
it
What do you
possible
think? Do you have any thoughts?
that if you meet and you don't have a quorum, you suspend the rules?
You're not meeting. You're not really meeting.
I'm just saying.
Well, Mike,
Let me think about
Mike is
that.
thinking about it at my request, because I really would like to be able to talk to everyone and, you know, help sort of shepherd the work. So, the next item.
Hang
What-
on,
one-
what's the deal? Because
What-
she doesn't have a vote,
She's on the committee.
she's on the committee,
Yep.
but she doesn't have the vote. What's the problem with her just checking in with us individually?
Well-
If it's not about something that we're gonna be voting on?
Right.
Well, I need to look at that because part of the task of any committee, in addition to having things to vote on, is to gather information. That is part of your role as a committee. And to the extent you've got, you know, the spoke and all the, you know, or the hub and all the spokes going out doing the same thing through one person, you could have a problem. But she's talking about things that may be totally different than that, but I'm not ready to say that she can do that without having a better idea of how it's going to work and exactly what the topics are going to be. That's why I came up with this idea, well, maybe you can have coffee or lunch and, you know, people can show up, but I hadn't thought through the quorum issue. So, you know, this is,
Well, could we have a one-on-one coffee? Listen, I can talk an hour about my dog, so that does not have to do with the government task force.
But you're talking about walking quorum. He's talking about walking quorum
Yeah.
on matters that may be in front of us in the future.
right.
But if it's just a general how's it going,
Oh, I was just told to put assessment check-in on every future agenda, so that's kind of
Well,
a how's it going question.
Well, that's how's your work going, but,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I'm sort of, I think I'm a relational person. I work best that way. This is really awkward. I'm
But
trying to
can I just
comply.
interrupt? Is the check-in regarding the subcommittees an assessment versus having lunch and asking how a person is?
But assessments, it sounds like assessments can happen without the need for public notice.
Come clean my apartment, it's not big enough for all of us, so we can take shifts.
Okay, well,
Oh, my
this is
Lord.
we're thinking about this.
Yes, yes.
One thing, before you move on, it would be,
So,
I don't know.
Madam Chair?
yes.
Before you move on, it might be nice to have a motion formally approving those 3 subcommittees that you have set up by, sort of by acclamation.
Good idea.
Are you appointing someone to be on the first round of the communication committee tonight? Or are we gonna do that
Who would
next
like to
time?
volunteer to be on the committee?
I'll be on it. Get it out of the way early.
Sherry, okay. That's Maggie, Sherry, and Rebecca.
I'll be on it.
All right.
Motion.
Is there a motion to create a communication subcommittee, an executive committee?
John here, Justice.
Justice,
I thought
Justice moved.
moved for all of the committees.
Eric has seconded.
Well, yeah, Sherry.
Sherry did.
I didn't second, I thirded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Mike. John?
I have a question for the city attorney. As formally constituted subcommittees, are we also then subject to notice of any of our meetings?
Yes, those will be noticed, and
Yeah,
those will be public
okay,
meetings.
as long as
Yep.
this.
Okay.
Yep.
And there are certain requirements that we would have then, which would be a public comment section at the beginning of those
Probably,
meetings?
yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people are going to.
Just wanted to make sure that's, I don't disagree. I just wanted to
But
make
would
sure
really
that
be,
The start of the agenda will look a lot like these do, because those are things that have to be on every agenda. I will probably not formally set them up as committees in Legistar. I'll just use this committee's heading and then say this is a meeting of the such and such subcommittee. So everybody will look at it and think it's the whole committee, but then when they look at the agenda, they'll see, oh, it's just a group. Otherwise, we'll have a proliferation of 15 committees, subcommittees, and We don't want to do that.
Would you be able to send the task force members just a little set of bullet points about what we need to do before our subcommittees and work groups can meet?
Sure.
Thank you. Are we good to move on?
I am.
To item 9, use of funds budgeted for task force. I wonder if this is an item that we want to have on the next agenda as well. I don't think that we have anything before us.
I think we should refer it.
Yeah, let's refer
Should we? Okay.
Well, hang on, I have some discussion about it. Okay, could we have it be like a standing item on every meeting?
That's what I
It
was
is.
told to do last
It
meeting.
is.
Yeah.
It is.
So then you don't need
Okay,
to.
so we don't have to refer.
You don't have to refer it.
Okay, so it'll be on the
Okay.
next agenda.
But I have, as the first ad hoc working group formed, I have an idea for use of funds for that. And that was back to the very beginning of our meeting when we were talking about open houses. It might be fun to have an open house party with food and stuff for current and former alders, boards, commission members, and all of that somewhere where we can all just hang out and have conversations. And we might have surveys available, and we might have, other things. Yeah.
That's why I brought up the apartment cleaning.
So that's just an idea for that group to consider.
It would be good for that group to consider that. Good.
That would require funds. That would definitely
Right.
require funds.
Right? But we'll be hearing the plan on April 30th. We can approve use of funds then.
Good.
Okay, moving on to item 10, items for future agendas. We have a bunch of standing items. Are there any other items that we need on the next agenda?
Well, are we planning on reviewing plans from executive committee and this, the subgroup to engage, what's that committee called? Engage the public officials?
The ad hoc working group, we have a check-in, we're going to have a check-in and assessment from all working groups on all future agendas. So we will be hearing reports.
Okay.
But I think, so to Eric's point, that one of the agenda items will naturally be the next steps or the recommendation of that ad hoc group on engaging current and future, or current and former elected officials.
Do we need to be that specific on the agenda?
No.
It will probably be styled as a report of this subcommittee
Sure.
and potential decision by this
Yeah.
task force.
Okay, that sounds good.
So the
basically what I
other procedural question is, how do we call meetings of these subcommittees?
We're gonna get an email about that, and then
Do you want to do it? Because I mean, I think,
Subcommittee thing we can just do, right?
well, yeah,
Right. I think what we do is we email the members of a subcommittee and say, here are some dates you can meet.
but I understand that this was supposed, at least the subcommittee or working group that was going to interview alders and mayors, et cetera, was going to work with the city attorney's office staff on that?
Who's going to what?
Work with the city attorney's staff on
Yes.
that?
Yeah.
So that's why I was suggesting that maybe you could organize that next meeting?
We will organize it.
Okay, oh, okay, all right. I just wanted to make sure that none of us were supposed to do it. That's all.
and does that have to be noticed?
Yes, it will have to be noticed, but we can take care of that. Once I get a date and time when those folks can meet, we'll notice it up and we'll have a meeting.
Does anyone have anything else under items for future agendas?
I don't know if it would be beneficial, but there is a digital version of the beautiful art that you all created that I can share if you want that. But I mean, you can always just frame what you have.
Get a prize if we're the closest one.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chair, because that's one of the models that was presented today, and we will, techniques, and we will also share ours as well.
Send it to the city attorney and tell them it's approved.
Okay.
He'll decide whose art is best. Anything else on items for future agendas? All right, I think that we can entertain a motion for adjournment. Second. All in favor? All right. Very good, thank you.